in my life, and I am primarily interested in these questions of of lived experience and of how, I don't know, I was not really prepared for this, but being in the world, it's interesting for me. There we go.
And then if Isaiah could just say a couple words of introduction, and then we'll begin.
Can you hear me?
Yes, sir.
Yeah, all right. So I'm primarily interested in sort of Heidegger's Kantian roots. And so I have a very academic sort of trajectory in relation to Heidegger. This is given my background. So I'm gonna be a graduate student at Duquesne in the fall. So that's kind of the trajectory of my interest in Heidegger specifically. You know, in terms of like my long-term goals, they're primarily based around Kant and his critique of pure reason. So that's pretty much it. I mean, there's a lot more to that, but yeah, I think that captures it.
Awesome. Well, sorry everybody for the 15 or so minute delay. We spent the last half hour trying to get something set up so that you'd be able to see everyone at this table all at once and hear us, but the microphone on the other laptop, it turns out, is probably busted or the driver's broken or something like that. So anyway, and so something else we'll have to be doing, I guess, is switching between the screens. This is what Kristen was doing last week. So anyway, I think, so this kind of like threw me off kilter, and so I guess we'll just open up with questions that people have about the text. We have a sort of roadmap through chapters 1 and 2 already there in the notes that we can kind of walk through. But also we want to see, yeah, if anyone has questions off the get-go here, that would be a great way to start. So.
You're hiding right here. Just a little further, a little further. There you go.
Yeah, see, it's hard to get everybody on the screen at once, but oh,
Yeah. That comes from our era.
a lot of terrible things can happen. So, for a show of hands, did anybody get a chance to look at the collaborative note document? Sammy? Tied on two? Anybody here? If you write in the comments box, we won't be able to see it.
I didn't hear the question.
Oh, yeah, we were asking if anybody was able to get a look at the collaborative notes document.
Okay, can you hear me talk?
I did not get a look. I did not look at that document.
I didn't look at it either.
Great. Okay. Well, we'll just walk through that a little bit.
Is it just that Dave's too far away?
Yes, it was breaking up a little bit, maybe something like that. Distortion.
We might just have to call this off till next week if we're not really get this.
No, you can hear. You sit closer.
Just saying.
No, guys, I can hear you. I can hear you fine.
What might help? What might help is if everybody besides you guys turn down their bandwidth. That might help with the audio. If it is breaking up.
People on Wi-Fi here. Yeah, everyone get off Wi-Fi if you're on.
Oh.
No. The other people in the talk, you can turn down your bandwidth. There's in the top. There's the middle button with the like Wi-Fi kind of symbol. It says adjust bandwidth, and if everybody turns that down, if you click on that, you can turn your bandwidth down, and that can sometimes help with the audio problems.
I think that only applies to people who aren't using Apple. Apple has different settings, but it should show up for people who are not on Apple. And even if a few people do it, that should help.
It showed up for me. I'm on Apple.
Yeah, same here.
Okay.
So, I will just talk for another couple of seconds, and at the end of this sentence, just show me some thumbs if it was a continuous sentence without any disruption or breakup of any sort. Was that all clear? Did that all come out just fine?
You sound great to me.
Thumbs are up. I sound great. Awesome.
Except for Lydia. So
Might be your
It might
Might
be.
be her
It might be.
computer.
Yeah, because if everyone else is thumbing up, then it's probably that Wi-Fi there.
I minimized my bandwidth, so I'm not going to be on the screen. That's good.
I also
We will,
so I'm confused.
This was just like a line. We didn't use something.
what did you say, Lydia?
I said I also gave a thumbs up. So I'm
Oh,
confused.
I didn't see your thumbs up. Okay. We're good.
Yeah, this technology thing is jarring for this one time for some reason. It wasn't before. It's because we tried something new. So my immediate idea is that Ty and I, both being here during the week, will try to set up some test session this weekend and get that all sorted out so that this is not it's not going to be a problem next time, hopefully. So anyway, everyone, welcome. It's really great to have everyone back. I'm really glad Isaiah was able to get on board with this. Sammy and I are both huge fans of Duquesne University. Duquesne University is like one of the foremost continental philosophy loving universities in the country. And we've actually had one of the professors from their psychology department out here. It's one of the only psychology departments in the world you'll find where they're teaching Heidegger and Levinas and Derrida and Merleau-Ponty and Lacan. And so it's just a really cool place. We got to go to a conference there back in the day. And Isaiah, if anyone missed it, is like really interested on how is Heidegger responding to Kant, which is actually a really great sort of intro here, because I read the introduction, the second part of the second introduction in preparation for this conversation, and it's not a required part of the reading. We talked about this last week. It's not something we're going to be reading yet, but I was just like, well, I better check to see what's here. And there are a couple things that might be relevant, but for the most part, I have this hunch that the second part of the introduction is actually, or the second introduction is actually the introduction to the second division. So you might, if you saw the collaborative notes document, you will have seen that there are notes there from yours truly for introduction 1 and then for chapters 1 and 2. And I plan on going back and rereading the second introduction when we get to division 2, and then I'll add some notes there. For the most part, it's harder reading than most of the rest of this, and so that's kind of why we decided not to require it, because that's Hubert Dreyfus's recommendation, and so we just kind of went with it. But as far as Kant goes, it is interesting. There are a few pages in chapter, or in introduction 2, where he is talking to Kant, and I've also been reading a lot of Lee Braver, who is one of the foremost Heidegger scholars in the country, but also has a lot to just say to the continental and analytic traditions of philosophy. So last week, I gave a quick crash course on the division between analytic and continental philosophy, really where it goes Hegel and Heidegger in one direction, and it goes Russell, Frege, Wittgenstein in the other direction. Lee Braver's whole project is trying to get the two camps to begin talking again in this century. And so it's pretty great that he's a Heideggerian doing this. But really like the crash course he gives at the beginning of the text that I'm reading, the name of which I can share later. It's escaping me at the moment, but I think it was published in 2007. And he gives a quick crash course on why Kant is so influential in this split, and then how the two camps are responding to Kant. And I'll just kind of like summarize something and then throw it over to Isaiah to see if he wants to add anything to it. But the basic idea, taking off of what Frank said last week about Aristotle and the categories and properties and such, is basically just that what Kant did was try to unite the empiricists and the rationalists, and in doing so develops this tremendous framework that's almost inescapable in some ways, that leaves you with the notion that we really have no way out of this problem, where we don't really know if we have access to the world as it is, and basically that the mind is part of a fabrication process, or part of a creative process that interprets sensory input. And so while there is a real world out there for Kant, we might not have access to it ever. And I don't know if that's a good enough summary. It's obviously going to butcher it, but Isaiah, does that do him enough justice for now?
So I mean, are you trying to relate the question of Kant in relation to this distinction between the analytic tradition and the continental tradition? Was that the crux? Or were you just trying to capture what Kant is doing, or what he's important? How?
Kind of, yeah. The problem that he develops, that the problem for any sort of realism.
Right. So I mean,
the idea that,
the reason why I framed my question in the initial way that I did is because different traditions are going to appropriate Kant in different ways, right? And so how Frege, for example, is going to appropriate Kant is radically different than someone like Hegel and the German idealist project and Heidegger, et cetera, and the phenomenologists that are trying to react to Kant, right? So I guess that's what I was just generally saying. For example, the analytic versus synthetic distinction is hugely influential in relation to the analytic tradition up until someone like Quine, whereas for the continental tradition, it's almost like non-existent part of the text, whereas like the a deduction and the notion of synthesis and the notion of the imagination is such a huge influential concept in relation to the German idealist tradition and to phenomenology in general. So that's, I guess, what I was trying to say. I mean, if you're trying to capture like articulate Kant in like one second, then yeah, sure, right? There's this issue of subjectivity that's raised in Kant, and it's hugely influential through analytic tradition, through the continental tradition, etc. So hopefully
cool.
That's yeah.
Yeah, it's not something that we will really have to get into just yet. But the reason I kind of brought it up was because it's something that I'm sure we'll be returning to, and so a few introductory remarks for now seemed appropriate. Yeah, now we've got a few, as far as just the conversations that will be happening for the rest of this course go. We've got a few ideas for how we want to try to structure these. A couple of formulas we tried with the Saussure reading. One was that one person takes the lead and they basically roadmap it for everybody, which with Saussure was a lot easier than it's going to be with Heidegger. But that person also comes prepared with a bunch of questions. We had talked about maybe just playing this one by ear and kind of seeing what comes up, because the conversation last week was pretty good, and just the questions and reflections or responses that even Lydia and Andy brought to the table were enough to stimulate conversation for a good hour, I think. So we're gonna wing it this time, and then have a meta conversation afterwards, after this is over. So about 9:10, if you're able to hang around, we'll talk about format for next week, and we might just delegate sections to different people to bring questions for, depending on how this all goes. And if the questions aren't enough, then we will just go through the notes, I guess, and kind of talk about it. But for now, I'd like to open it up to people's reflections, comments, questions on chapter 1. Help me out, people.
Yeah, dude, I definitely have questions. I need like 5 seconds to kind of flip through my book and look at the notes I made for the reading.
Same.
I'm gonna grab a cup of coffee while we do that.
Oh, did you say mute?
No.
No, again, that's for a refill.
We need a new pot.
Should make one. Can I use your red?
Yeah.
That's me, I know. Yeah.
Sorry.
I don't even know how to start a conversation on this book. I'm gonna be honest.
We'll talk about the ontological difference again if push comes to shove.
Yeah, I mean, it would never hurt to go there, and then the existential.
I can start.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I have a question, or no, a note. Okay, so we are not muted right now. On page 75, section 60, or 50, I mean. Which is here. This whole page seems pretty important to me. Even dog-eared it. Wow. Because here it seems like Heidegger is explaining why we have to get back to what he calls decisive ontological foundations. And so what holds up every other discipline, every other field of study would seem to be ontological problematics. Which I guess, especially in this little section where he's talking about psychology, anthropology, psychology, or whatever, biology, it's easy in everyday life to, or you see this being done a lot where people will reduce things back to like biology. And then it goes like, oh, well, that's just psychology. Oh, well, psychology is just biology, and biology is just this, and then this is just physics, and that's just mathematics. And so, like, in the end, it all gets reduced back down to mathematics. There's a really great comic that I've seen. It's by, what is it, XCDK or whatever, that like nerdy comic, where there's a picture of those fields, and they're all like pointing at each other and calling each other less pure, right? And then mathematics is just like, oh, I'm the purest field. But then underneath, holding it all up, is epistemology. And I think Heidegger wouldn't say epistemology is holding all of those things up necessarily, because later in the chapter, or in the next chapter, he digs at, well, our primary mode of being isn't just knowing, right? So it's not epistemology, how we know things. But there's this like being alive in the world. So what supports all of those other fields of inquiry is ontological problematics, which is just like, oh, how are we being? Who, not who are we, but how are we? Because we're the beings asking the question. So I thought that page and section were really crucial.
Actually, somebody in our philosophy department scratched out epistemology and wrote phenomenology underneath that.
That was me.
Oh. Sammy wrote it. Okay.
It was bothering me.
Yeah, that's definitely what he's saying here, and it's something that he talks a lot about in the introduction as well. It's basically just this idea that everybody has a working notion of how the pieces fit together or what they mean, and that is in some way an ordering principle or a guiding principle in how we render interpretations of being, without being, before we've even really conducted studies in these other sciences. And so the class we took on being in time actually would the professor continuously referred to this as the pre-scientific knowledge that we all have, which is not going to be the language that Heidegger uses, but I find it useful in thinking about it, at least.
I mean, wouldn't he just say that's a pre-ontological understanding of being? Right. That's a sort of initiation into the possibility of a more theoretical and more rigorous science of ontology, right? Or at least that's my understanding.
Right.
I think that's what Heidegger was trying to do with this book, right? Is have a more rigorous understanding of ontology.
Of fundamental ontology too, right? And what Isaiah raises is actually kind of what we spent a while towards the end of the last session discussing and being. I think the more we talked about it, the more confused I got. And the basic idea was like we were trying to nail down what exactly does he mean by pre-ontological. But I think the way you said it as the possibility for more complex theories of being is good. I think that's a good enough working definition of it. Also, in chapter 1, when he gives the example, remember that part when it's in Latin and Greek? It's on page 74. He's right here giving 2 examples where it says 1 and 2. He's giving 2 examples of pre-ontological understandings, because depending on your culture, whether it's very influenced by the Greeks or very influenced by Christianity, any one of these, or possibly a mixture of both, very well might be informing how you think about being, at least the humankind, because here it's halfway down is man is here defined as, and then some Greek that means the animal rationale or rational animal. The one lower than that, he doesn't actually say what it is, but it's man is made in the image of God, right? The following from the creation myth in Genesis. So, and he's just using those as a couple of examples, but I think we touched on this last week. Dreyfus uses the distance that people talk from one another in casual conversation, depending on culture. That's also a sort of understanding. It's a sort of pre-ontological understanding of how to be in the world. Does anybody else have any other thoughts about the pre-ontological or questions about it?
I have a question.
Take her away.
So my question is when Heidegger talks about like being in the world, and he refers to the world, I'm kind of thinking about it in kind of a spatial context. Is he talking about like, I mean, I assume it's not, it's so hard to express this, but is he talking about planet Earth? Is he talking about the universe? Is he talking about the parts of the world that we can access? Is he talking about parts of the world that we can access and parts that we don't even know about? Like what? It's super frustrating because I don't feel like I have the language to ask this question correctly. But what does he mean by the world? Like just the things we encounter in our everyday life, or is it something more than that?
I think at the very least, it is the it's the world. It's what Dasein finds itself in relationship with.
I think it's wrong to think of it as spatial, though.
That's too.
Which is what you kind of started with. Just like on page 80, I think it is. He's pretty clear that it isn't spatial. I'm trying to find it. I have it in my notes as being on page 80, but I'm not sure if it's actually there.
Well, it's where he basically begins on the page previous to that one, on 79, right at the bottom, to say this is right after he breaks down what the next 3 chapters will be, and then in the 3rd chapter he's going to get it in the 3rd section of breaking down being in the world. He's going to get into being in, but then he jumps ahead. He says, but before we go any further, we're going to have to touch on that really quick. by being in, we don't mean being in like inside of a cup or inside of a room. And because we're not talking about being alongside things in the world the way a table could be alongside a wall. And not because it doesn't touch it, but because it can't encounter it. It has no relation to it.
Yeah, I think a really simple way of summarizing it is the world is what we are thrown into and encounter in our lived experience. So the language is part of the world. It's not necessarily spatial in the sense that you can really touch language or something, but you come up against it. Like basically everything that is encounterable, that we encounter because we are here in the world, or we are here amid all those things. That's the world. It's not the earth.
Yeah, I mean, it really, the part I marked up the most was the bottom of page 81.
Oh, yeah.
It starts, taken strictly, touching is never what we are talking about in such cases, not because accurate re-examination will always eventually establish that there is a space between the chair and the wall, but because in principle the chair can never touch the wall, even if the space between them should be equal to 0. And then it goes on and on, because the way that the chair relates to the wall is different from the way that Dasein relates to the wall.
Right, because the chair is not encountering the wall as a being that is aware of its own being. It's just touching.
This what you're asking though really gets at something essential here, and it is jumping ahead, but I think relevant just to say it. On page 93 from chapter 3, he gives 4 definitions of the word world.
Yeah. No, I definitely, I read chapter 3, and I think maybe that's why some of my confusion is coming from. But let me, I guess, rephrase the question, because I can kind of understand why he's not talking about like literal physical relationships. But when he talks about relationality, is he talking about something that can be mapped?
Oh, interesting.
Map, I don't know, map, certainly experience from, from the point of view of the individual person. But
Could you give an example of something
yeah,
that can't,
say more what you mean by map.
like what can't be mapped?
So like, for example, you can map the human genome, even if you don't necessarily, that's not the type of literal, like proximate, like this gene is to the left of this gene, right? But you are creating kind of a model for understanding the relationality of certain entities.
It was available then.
It was.
Yeah.
Well,
So something that you can sort of set up in a network of relationality, or think of as being in a network of relationality.
Yeah, I think so.
But I think part of it is that the difference is there's always going to be that existential divide between a map that is expressing relationships in some symbolic representational way, and the way that the human being is living in and experiencing that relationship directly through their senses.
Yeah, so it's almost like it's a really good question, because there's being, right, and being in, and you are always alongside all of these things, right, and you're alive, you're being, but the world, like, is it, I don't know, for instance, language with human genome or something that you can be mapped? What about the stuff that escapes the mapping? Is that part of just being, or is that also part of the world? That's a really interesting question.
So on the one hand, I wanted to say, when it comes to mapping the genome, that's only going to be a part of the world for the scientists that deal with these concepts, right? Now, are they relevant to every human being in the sense that it somehow is a part of our bodies or the bodies in our worlds? Yes, but that this would be where he uses the word world with quotation marks because it's ontic, it's ontical, it's the physical world, which is part of the world. But the way he's using world here is the way that one would say the world of the professor or the world of the scientist, the world of
The frog.
no.
I think it's a question that's left open.
Yeah, I'm just going. Well, I guess I'm just going off of what Dreyfus says, and so it's not necessarily the case. But also on 93, he wants world to. I'm pretty sure that he wants the kind of world he's talking about is when we have that cliche question: if a tree falls in the forest. And no one's there to hear it, does it make a sound? It's almost like this kind of world that he's working with, this conception of world that he's developing, the answer is going to be no. And he would say, yes, it does in the quote unquote world, in the ontic world, but he's trying to develop this other thing that he says we won't be able to understand until we've worked through all three of the chapters that unpack the different pieces of what being in the world is.
You couldn't possibly know what a tree feels like when it falls.
Does that make sense? And does that?
I think that makes sense, but I think that makes this project a little too more idealistic than he would like.
Do explain.
And it seems like you're just equivocating upon subjectivity in the world, right? And it seems like what he wants is a little more than that, right? He wants something that's like the very possibility of something like the issue of idealism and realism to be arising, right? So world is something more than merely just something that a realist could take issue with or an idealist could take issue with, right? I mean, this is the whole sort of ontological move, or the sort of move towards ontology. It's something, the very possibility of something like this epistemological question about whether or not there is a world out there, quote unquote, is this more derivative sense of world, right? And he's looking for a more original sort of sense of world. Now, what that fully is in terms of explicating it, I have difficulty also. But at least I think what he's aiming for is that. Now, whether he's successful or not is another question.
Yeah.
Wow.
He definitely gets accused of idealism in this.
Yeah, right.
And he definitely, this is said to be his anti-realist phase.
Right.
And after his turn, he's then a realist. So I can't speak to that very much.
Yeah, no, I mean, so there.
I've heard it argued though that it's not that he is an anti-realist here. It's just that this is the ontological difference that he's trying to establish, and that he's not denying the existence of the ontic world. He's just saying that he's trying to develop this pretty complex and muddy concept that we're just barely broaching so far. I don't know.
Did you have more to add on that?
I have a question for Andrew on back to the mapping thing. By mapping, do you just mean like a map of the system in general, like how everything fits together? Or like a mapping between being and the objects, I guess, that the Dasein is interacting with?
I guess what I'm trying to get at is like, how can you understand relationality without being able to depict that relationality in some way? And like, I can get why certain concepts, like ontic concepts, like distance, like kilometers and miles, right, might be obfuscations of what Heidegger is trying to get us to see, right? But I want to understand how what he's trying to get us to see translates spatially. What it means when he says we are in the world, like what does that mean? And it's really frustrating because, again, I don't feel like I have the language to appropriately ask that question. To me, I guess what I'm saying is, like, if you have systems of relationality and Dasein navigates those systems, it would be able to, I mean, you would need a map.
Could I answer that question possibly?
Yeah,
right.
Yeah.
Right. So I think what you're getting at is essentially this more like this typical sense of space that we have in the Cartesian sense, right? And so what Heidegger is going to say, so maybe this might not be satisfactory, but at least my understanding is something like the following. He's going to say something like the possibility of space, objective space, in the sort of scientific sense, is going to be grounded in this more original sense of space in terms of being in the world, right? And that this itself is, he's going to call it de-distancing, right? And he's going to call it this sort of relation that we have, Dasein has with the things that it encounters in the world. And this relation of spatiality, of original spatiality, is going to be that which grounds or allows for the possibility of something like this more objective sense of space that we usually have and traverse the world with, right? So when I go on Google Maps and I have this sort of distance, right, that itself, he's going to say, and how I understand that is grounded in this more original relation that I have with things in the world, right? And that itself is going to be called de-distancing, right? I mean, I don't know the specific translation, but that was in my, text, right? And so that is going to be this more original sense of space, and this allows for something like this more mapping relation that you're looking for, I think, maybe. So
I wanted to really quickly, well, Andy, actually, you can respond first, but I have a quote that I think would be a question I actually had that would illuminate this a little bit. So I don't know, Andy, if you had something like else to say first, or.
So to me, the de-distancing concept, when I encountered that in the text, I thought of Zizek's explanation of ideology, and he kind of points to this movie where this dude finds a box of glasses, and whenever he puts on the glasses, he kind of sees the hidden messages beneath billboards or televisions, right? So he looks at a billboard that has an advertisement of like, a Coca-Cola can, and he looks at it through the glasses and it says like, oh, babe. Do y'all know what I'm talking about? The example I'm talking about? I feel like it's kind of. Yeah,
it's a pretty funny example, but go ahead.
Yeah, and when he was talking about de-distancing, I thought that he was kind of talking about it. He was talking about spatiality in terms of like layers of ontic meaning that prevent us from perceiving things as they are. Was that kind of your understanding of de-distancing as well?
So the example that I would use is that, like, if I were to point to something, it's kind of hard to use through, like, I wish I was like in an actual physical space to show you this, right? But like if I point to something, right, and I have this relationship of like, I'm here over here and that thing is over there, right? That spatial relationship is born out of myself relating to whatever that entity is, right? And so I would say that de-distancing, what he's speaking about is that sort of ontological relationship that I have with other things in the world that I encounter, right? And so that, I think he's going to say something like that ontological relationship allows for this possibility of this more derivative sense of space that we sort of get with someone like Descartes or Newton in more scientific senses where, I have this sort of, I'm 12 inches away from the spoon or whatever, right? And that's going to be more derivative, at least in the Heideggerian sense. And the more original sense is going to be that ontological relationship. It's not going to be an ontic thing. I can't point to it out in the world, right? It's going to be this concept that I explicate, obviously, philosophically, right? So, I mean, I don't know if I can give like a physical manifestation of that relationship, because then that would immediately make it ontic. So. No,
but what I think you're saying, or maybe what I think I'm asking, is if like, and I think that this is kind of the same, but like spatiality, like physical spatiality, is like a characteristic of that pre-existing ontological relationship. Like it, in the same way that like, I mean, it's arbitrary in the same way that an object's color is arbitrary, or like, when Heidegger's talking about relationality, he's not talking about spatiality, or if he is, spatiality is kind of like a secondary characteristic of that relationship. Would that be accurate?
Okay, so his sense of spatiality, so you're going to have to disambiguate like between an ontological sense of space, right, and a sort of ontic sense of space, is the way that I would characterize it, just to sort of make sure that we're on the same page.
Yeah, and I guess what I would be saying is like that ontic space is kind of a characteristic of that pre-existing ontological relationship. Or it's something that obscures that pre-existing ontological relationship. It's not a characteristic of it, but like it's ontic knowledge, I guess. Spatiality would be ontic knowledge, right?
So the possibility of that ontic sense of space is grounded in, or is founded in that more original sense of space in the ontological relational sense. That's what I think you would say.
To help eliminate this sort of thing, so Andy, it seems to me you're like, well, spatiality, in the sense of what's that word for extended bodies?
Extensivity.
No, it's something else. But
Deleuze is extensivity.
But basically, okay, the fact that we take up space, right? And that space exists in a sense. Andy, you're like, yeah, that's just part of like the world or what is, you know, and then but you feel like Heidegger maybe is putting spatiality in the ontic realm and not the ontological realm. Okay, so on page 85, he makes this distinction right at the beginning of section 59 between decont and erkant, familiar versus where the beginning of space page for section 59.
That's not section, that's original translation.
Or, I've been thinking of those
So
sections.
these are sections.
Oh,
Yeah,
my notes are all wrong.
it's okay.
Okay, original page 59. Erkant and Bekant. So, both in Dasein and for it, the state of being is always in some way familiar. Now, if it is also to become known, and so I stopped right there and I was like, familiar versus known. And so it would seem that spatiality or extension, that's what I was looking for, is part of our experience, right? We're familiar with it because it's, you know, everything seems to have some sort of extensiveness, you know, all these things we encounter and our own selves, right? But making it become known is another step, right? Because knowing is a different mode of being, but knowing is predicated on being or being familiar, being in. And so this whole next little bit that Heidegger explores is like, well, up to now we've been saying, or philosophy's been like, knowing is the primary way of being in the world, right? So we know things, and that's like foundational. And he's like, no, there's something underneath that, something more foundational, which is just being. And so any spatiality that we know, that we map, because I think mapping fits into knowing, right, is already founded on the experience of extendedness in space. I don't know if that helps, but that's where my mind went.
There's two things that I'd throw in there. I will find this quote, I swear. I can't find it right now. And I'm not even sure if it's here in one of his essays, but there's a time when he talks about how the person you're thinking about is ontologically closer than the table in front of you, or something along those lines. And actually, you know, so, and I want to just caveat even what this report that I'm giving and say that I'm not exactly sure if that's right. But it's been here this whole time this conversation's been going on, and so I've been like, I think that was something I read. Now I need to look further into that. All I'll say for now is that I will look further into that. But then I wanted to give another example of ontological versus ontic using temporality instead of spatiality, but two, in the scientific sense or in traditional philosophic senses, are often spoken about metaphorically. And so just to say that, like, the experiential, relational, the relational experience of time is different than clock time, right? You know, when you're bored, time drags on forever. When you're having fun, it goes by in minutes. You know, if your job sucks, then it takes a million years. But, you know, we're all familiar with this. That would be the ontological, the more experiential, the more primordial. I think that would be the more primordial experience of time, and that this might be able to be translated or used as a metaphor for understanding this difference between spatialities that we're talking about. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that's actually super helpful, because that kind of sets up what I'm looking for. Like, that sets up a comparison point. Like, that makes sense to me, the way that we experience time versus the way that we measure time, right? And I think what I'm looking for is that kind of understanding, but in the context of, like, spatiality. Like, I can understand why certain measurements would be, like, ontic and just kind of like something we've created, but I don't understand how space itself could be experienced subjectively when we're all in the same world.
So I actually was thinking about this too. So are you kind of referencing back to that, like, what page is that where he's talking about the being in versus the being in a cup or something?
Right, it's like 79 through 81 is where he talks about that.
Okay, so there he's like, yeah, we're not in the world the same way that, like, this pen is now in the cup. But so there's another section, and I didn't write it down, so I can't refer to it, but he's talking about how we look out at the world, not as if we're, like, stuck within ourselves, but we're in the world, we see a cup and a pen, and we put it in, and we're like, just as this is in this, I must be in the world. So we infer the way that we are ontologically from our experience of, like, ontic things, almost, I guess.
Absolutely.
Right? And so at the very end of chapter 2, like the very last few pages, page 90, he says, okay, wait, or no, it's page 89. It's page 89. He says that even the error or something. Where is that? Where's that thing? It's like about the error.
Drop sign directs itself towards something, grasps.
So even the error, even the erroneous characterizations that we have about ourselves or about things are founded on our ontological experience. So even if we have this erroneous idea that we are in the world the same way a pen is in the cup, it's founded on our experience of looking out at pen and cup, and, you know.
Absolutely.
So it's an error for us to think of spatiality in maybe a sort of, like, so we have this experience of spatiality, right? Of our own, which is just being, and that's the closest to us, so it's the most invisible. But we also have an experience of spatiality of objects, and so we look at these and they're not invisible because they're not so close to us. And then we infer, we're the same as these things.
So we're borrowing metaphors that have baggage kind of already attached to them to sort of explicate our understanding of spatiality. Is that kind of what you're saying?
Our explication of our own experiencing of spatiality, I guess.
Yeah. So, like,
I found a quote that's perfect for it. So if anyone wants to look at that on 36, at the bottom of 36.
That's in the introduction.
Clear back there.
Yeah, he says this in a few spots, and eventually it'd be nice to, in the notes, have all the places that he said his basic thesis. in different ways, all lined up. I've been trying to do that with a few other theses he argues, but at the bottom of 36, he says the kind of being which belongs to Dasein is rather such that in understanding its own being, it has a tendency to do so in terms of that entity towards which it comports itself proximally and in a way which is essentially constant, in terms of the world, in quotes, which is the ontic world, which is the world of things and stuff. So we tend to look at the being, we look at beings around us such as hammers and trees, and then we infer that's being. That being is the thing that those things have in common with us. Therefore, our being would be the same kind of being.
I wonder if a way that we can think about the spatial dimension is to think about the spatial dimension through the temporal dimension. And what I mean by this is, let's suppose I have to commute 30 minutes a day for work. The first day I commute for work, that drive is going to seem to be a lot shorter, both spatially, or it's going to seem a lot longer spatially and temporally than, say, the 25th time I do that drive or the 100th time I do that drive, right? Each time that space is to some degree going to shrink, but some days I might be having a bad day and I'm in more of a theoretical attitude and thinking about what's going on. And in those circumstances, that distance is going to seem a lot longer. So I wonder if, in that sense, my relation to the distance that's being traversed shifts. Or even if something like what we're doing right now, like spatially, I feel quite close to you guys, even though you're all over the U.S. or all over the world. That spatial dimension is shifted based on my lived experience of that. And maybe the first time that I experience webcam or something like that, that's going to shift my understanding of that spatiality every other time I use a webcam, right? So my experience of talking to you this week is shaped by experience of talking to you last week or the time before, and that's all impacting the spatial dimensions of my spatial reality and also my temporal reality. And I think that's like the being with on the basis of already having been shaping my lived experience of towards the future.
Well, the original comment, I think Andy might have made about, what does the subjective experience of space seem like? I cannot remember if it was someone from the medieval era or later. We talked about human beings living in and dealing with the world in terms of the middle distance. And what they meant there is, dealing with the world in terms of the human scale. So there's all of these things that are happening around us and inside of us that are happening at the micro level, and we don't see those things. I mean, in theory, if you have a microscope or something like that, you might be able to. And then there's all of these things that are happening out in the universe, at astronomical distances, whether it's, black holes or, other solar systems or, whatever, things that are much, much larger than we have any way of contextually taking in. And then there's all of the things that happen at the middle distance, and the prejudice that we have is that all of the stuff that happens in the middle distance is like the real stuff, the things that's most real, so the things that happen, around us, the houses and streets and chairs and all of those things seem like the most readily relatable sorts of things, but that's because of our our senses and our size and all of those things. So yes, in the largest sense, space is space, but we're paying attention to, we are being in the world in relationship to those things that that we can relate to through our senses and our size and everything else and our culture contextually. So maybe thinking it in terms of, human beings dealing with the world from the standpoint of the middle distance. I don't know. Maybe that sheds some light on that question. But that's what Andy's comment got me to thinking about.
Yeah, all of that seems to kind of help me to understand it better, and maybe it helps me kind of put some understanding around a few things I've been thinking about that might actually relate to like how we're understanding this, the way that space, how we understand space objectively a little bit, and that it's interesting. When I moved to Seattle, I had like no money, right, and I couldn't afford to put gas in my car, so I turned into a walking person. All that to say, I walked everywhere for years, and I like probably drove once every month just to go get groceries if I had to get too many to carry back. But the relation, like I could, on a map, I could trace out, it was exactly 1.2 miles to the grocery store. But there was a major difference in the way I related to the space between walking to the grocery store versus driving to the grocery store, in that, like Frank was saying, like you're really distracting me. The way I related to, or what was important, or that I was aware of, was very different in the car versus walking. When I'm walking, I'm noticing, like, especially in Seattle, I've noticed the moss growing in the cracks of the sidewalk, and I'd noticed like people going in and out of buildings along the way. In the car, you can always only really distinctly remember, I left my house, I stopped at a couple stop signs or stoplights, and then I was at the store, right? Like they're two very different experiences that, like, as far as like charting out on a map ontically, I guess if we're gonna get it back to that, would be identical, right? Like I went down the street, I took a right on the street, I took a left on that street, pulled in the parking lot.
But your experience
is totally different, 100% different, right?
And people make the comment about, older cities, that were built before the car, are built on a human scale, as opposed to, it's the difference between, the downtown of, London versus, Los Angeles. Or,
well, zoning used to not be a thing because of that. It's like people's houses were near to the marketplace, were near to everything, so it could be like easily accessed. For now, it's like, well, everyone has a car, so we can have the subdivision way out here and the grocery store way over here.
But that really, but the ability to move through space under more than just our own bipedal locomotion has fundamentally changed our relationship to the world. And you even see this between, and simply bring out these, talk about the subjective experience of space, but in talking, with people that have come from the eastern United States to the west, it's like, everything seems so much more spread out, in the west. I was talking with someone who had recently come from New York, and they said they had to go to Salt Lake City the next day from Boise, which is what, 4 or 6 hour drive. It's a right. It's 6 hours. It's the better part of the day. We think it's like, it's not too far. That's something you can drive there in an afternoon, and they're like 6 hours. I could be in 2 states away in that amount of time. So what we think of as being our content, our context, our sphere, and so on, has been changed by technology, both in the sense of the car, but also as you're talking about using technology to be able to expand distance too. That's essentially been a tool for expanding the human scale, or expanding that middle distance.
Yeah, so kind of for me, what this conversation's helping me to do is what these first 2 chapters seem to be doing is, at least what I've been taking note of, is the difference between being in the world and the being that is present at hand, right? And trying to, like, we've been looking at being as just, like, we look out at the world And, we see things and they exist and, it's pretty self-evident, so we must be also existing in the same way. And he's saying, no, we have a different sort of being, which is the being in the world is this like relational, contextual being that exists.
Interpretive being.
Right. So like if really at the end of the day, it's just like, okay, so these are, for me at least, really concrete examples of like what that difference really is, because that's why the table and the wall really aren't ever touching, right? We're touching the things because of our relationship to them, and then we can actually process that relationship in a way, a table or a chair or whatever he uses.
And this is like I don't want to derail the conversation and get into this right now because it's not relevant necessarily for the rest of all of that. But this is where I think we can begin to include other living beings in sort of realm of concern, and move away from our deficient mode of care towards these beings. Because if you think about it, for a hawk, a distance, okay, so for a squirrel versus a hawk, a very long distance is going to have a totally different, like, experience for them. There's like everything that lives and interacts with its world. Like, I would say a tree can touch a table, but the table can't touch the tree. Do you know what I mean? Because there's a sense of interaction and change that, like, if a plant touches a certain substance, it will change, or an animal does. So, like, this is kind of where we can maybe at a later date in further works insert that critique of the anthropocentrism of philosophy.
Yeah, I feel an instant kind of gut, like, I don't know about that, but I don't want to get into it because
Right.
I've read the first 40, 50 pages, like,
Yeah.
I can say for an absolute fact that Heidegger would be fundamentally against that, and that we shouldn't even try talking about it until this book's over.
That's exactly it.
Yeah.
Totally. But yeah, I do want to have that conversation.
But the critique of anthropocentrism is definitely going to be one that he takes very seriously later. But really, I mean, the whole thing is not to say that the hawk doesn't have Dasein. It's to say we know we have it. So let's talk more about what we know we have that's different than this more classical Cartesian sort of mathematical sense of being that we've kind of set up as objective and ourselves as subjects opposed to, because he thinks, and Hannah Arendt will think, and just to name a couple, because it's someone we just read in a class last semester, but that the Archimedean point, as they call it, this God's eye view perspective of us in the universe, where we're basically insignificant, that is sort of a notion that is derived from this, sort of cosmic perspective, so that science has given us. Right, we can't actually have it, but we get this notion that ultimately life must be meaningless, if that's the case, and this is what he's really trying to fight here, and really what he's doing right now is setting up the conceptual apparatus to have a fight. We're far from that point, but that's really what's driving this is that objective world, and he's not saying it's not real, and that's just the one thing I want to return to is. He's not saying it's not real. He's not saying that it's not important, and he's not saying it's not true, because he says that it is true, but that the obviousness of this subject-object divide is a baleful fact if we leave it at that and don't analyze the kind of stuff going on before we get to that realization, because that's been kind of left unexamined.
So does he ever, and this is just a side question, does he ever address the sort of ontic sense that Dasein can have of its own being?
See again?
To be able to, does it, or what would that mean? For Dasein to be able to talk about its being in an ontic sense.
Right.
Is that simply to say I exist as opposed to not existing, but not talking about the experiential side of it, or does that does that ever get addressed at all? I mean, that was just one of the questions that popped up. You know, is there a, you know, because he's trying to get us to, you know, relate to this, you know, the human being, you know, to Dasein, you know, contextually and in this unique way that is not like objects just bumping against each other. You know, but can we talk about our existence just in an ontic sense?
We can, and I don't know, they would probably know better if Heidegger brings this up, but Hannah Arendt in The Human Condition, towards the end, definitely discusses this in the terms of when we take the Archimedean standpoint, we look down on humans as we look at like ants or antelope, and we're like, interesting, they do this, this, and that, as if we're not somehow already always in the midst of what is being done by the humans. You know, like we're looking at our being as an ontic entity. It's possible we can do that, but again, I think Heidegger might say it's because we know how to look at things in an ontic way, and so then we can sort of like do that to ourselves, you know?
I'm tracking with you right there. I just say, really, you can look at that stuff, figure that out.
Oh, about like human nature,
Yeah.
behavior. Yeah, no, it's because you're always already immersed.
All right.
Isn't that kind of, I mean, maybe I'm wrong about that, kind of what he's trying to do in the first place, is set this up against that we've been doing that.
That there's no
We've been looking at our being so objectively, we've lost track. Or we really have never really taken the time to say what separates us or what is this non-ontic. I mean, he kind of came up with this, like, we're going to separate the ontic from the ontical, but like we have been looking at it just as ourselves as sort of rational beings, and like once we determine or we can lay out how that works and what the schema is, then we will understand human nature.
That's what scares me the most.
Which we do more so today probably than ever, because we can tell you what our heart does and the boom. It's just like someone out there is trying to microphone on.
Yeah, I was going to say something, and so in relation to a question regarding this interpretation of the human being in the ontic sense, right? I mean, isn't this just Vorhandenheit, right? Presence at hand or objective presence, right? So essentially, the one modality of being, right, that's predominant within the tradition of philosophy that's been emphasized is objective presence, right? Or elesia in the Greek sense, or substance, etc., etc.
Right. The question is can we really have that kind of relationship to our own being? Because part of what it seems that Heidegger is suggesting, you know, is there's no objective place to stand. There's no context outside of ourselves where we can, you know, observe and comment and analyze human being from. There isn't a place like that. We don't get.
Oh, so like we've been trying to do that, but we're not even capable of it.
We don't get credit for that. No. Sorry.
I mean, I don't have a lot of knowledge regarding this, but isn't this what he's gonna? I mean, if you're familiar with it, but this whole notion of a hermeneutic circle, and right, always being thrown into a certain context and never being able to divorce yourself from that context, and you're always investigating from a particular situation, et cetera, from a particular interpretation, and you're always caught up in this circle, right? And you're never necessarily going to get out because that's the constitution of how you come to understand the world in general.
Right. Well, Dasein, it does seem like he is saying yes. Dasein is never devoid of context, and because you know, he talks about the thrownness and all that. You're always in a situation. You're always in a context. You never. There's no object. It seems like you say there's no objective place to stand outside of that. So whatever you're saying about the experience of being a being in the world is always from wherever it is that you're relating to the rest of the world.
Right. So another point I think that's insightful that I could say is that question would presuppose that there's some sort of exterior and some sort of interior thing. But what he wants to show is that being in the world is precisely the ontological sort of wholeness that's given, right? That's inseparable in this kind of way, right? So this is prior to any sort of sense of interiority, exteriority. There's no such thing as an outside or something, you know, a vantage point that you can somehow get to because.
So yeah, like on page 87, I found this page just like utterly fascinating, because he's talking about how the knowing, it's not like, so the problem of like analytic philosophers, or most of philosophy, of like, how do we know things, epistemology essentially, how does this knowing subject that is locked somehow inside of itself come out of its inner sphere into what is other and external? How can knowing have an object at all? And it's also linked to this attitude of going out, taking and bringing back, like for instance, memories or ideas. You go out, you take it, like a representation of, like I look at in this way of thinking about it, which is not Heidegger's way of thinking about it, is I go out, like something in me goes out like a camera, it takes the picture and it stores it like in my computer brain. And I think this is so so essential to like understanding this is the only way we're going to overcome any problems in our current world. So this has political relevance, this has ethical relevance, because if you think about how that schema for knowledge is also applied to, like, let's say colonialism, or this sort of attitude towards the world as resource, right? But there's all these ontic beings out here, and they're all just like, we can look at them present in hand and sort of be like, oh, we could use this part of it to do this thing. And it's like, there's no experience, there's no connection. Like, we're trying to erase the fact that we were originally related. Not related, he doesn't even want to use those words, right? But we originally are, in some sense, thrown into the world alongside these beings, these other beings, and that the self is not cordoned off into a cabinet, so to speak, but is always already in relation with everything else. So when you harm something out here, you're cutting, you're not just like going up to it and enacting a harm, you are like cutting something that already exists, like a tie that already exists. There's right, like on page 88, he says that in the middle of the page, he says that being in the world as concerned is fascinated by the world with which it is concerned. And if knowing is to be possible as a way of determining the nature of the present at hand by observing it, then there must be first a deficiency in our having to do with the world concernfully.
Which is also to say that, yeah, he gets into that a bit right here as well, is that the present in hand, any present in hand or ontic analysis is taking this, science assumes objectivity of disposition in approaching the world of things and gathering the data to experiment with, to reach, to form hypotheses and then eventually, test them and reach theories. But it's a detached mode, in which you'd call a deficient mode of care. He calls it the tarrying alongside, which he's not ragging on so much. It's just to say that it's like this, we have this full human way of being that's very, it's full. I'm using this language on purpose. So it's like full, a full range of things go on. But then to get to the ontic facts, to almost make it one-dimensional, we've had to strip it down to that which, everyone can agree, yep, that's repeatable.
One possibility.
But in doing so, we've outstripped everything else.
So it says so on page 89. When Dasein directs itself towards something and grasps it, it does not somehow first get out of its inner sphere and has been proximally encapsulated, but it's a primary kind of being in such that it always outside, alongside, entangles itself within its counters.
So can Dasein ever confront?
So Dasein can go out there and reach something?
No, he's saying
You don't even know what it is.
No, he's saying so the world is already discovered. And so when you go out and know something,
Right.
It's not as if you're encountering something that you haven't
Right.
already discovered.
So right here, he's saying
Yeah.
he's saying that that's our traditional conception of how knowledge works, but that's not. He's trying to get away from knowing as grasping, and towards something more like knowing as beholding or revealing.
So that brings me, this is why the same question keeps coming up for me, because is he saying, or is there an implication here then that Dasein cannot being cannot relate to it as its own being as present at hand? Is that what he's saying?
That's for booty.
It cannot relate to its own being.
As present at hand in an ontic sense.
Yeah.
He says that's definitely a way that we can. Actually, yeah.
So, just a quick comment to demonstrate this, I think, right? So I have vitamins, right? I need to go take some vitamins to sort of replenish, certain experiences that I have, right? So I can take my experiences and sort of do this sort of objective presence thing and treat myself as an object with certain parts, right? To completely detach from my experience of those things, right? So, for example, another way of doing this is, I'm experiencing some sort of traumatic event, right? And then instead of talking about that traumatic event, I'm speaking about my neurons firing in a particular way, right? And how there's certain things in my brain that are occurring such that I have this experience, right? So I treat myself essentially as an object, right? I have certain objective relations that are going on that constitute my experience, rather than sort of talking about my experience in sort of that contextualist way, right? So there are ways in which I can interpret myself in that sort of objective. I treat myself as an object, essentially, right? Something just brutally present. I don't know if that's a satisfying answer. So,
that's kind of what I was thinking of, as far as a way of putting some kind of experiential distance in our own experience. My question is whether is Heidegger saying that we can't really do that? I mean, that's
To like as close as we can get, we're always going to be missing the point because of our subjective
Sounds like a range.
I don't know if he's saying we can't do that. I think he's saying that the question, the foundational ontological question of being is primordial, in a sense. And it's so close to us because we are always being that it's been invisible. He literally says it's been invisible, like in chapter 2, right? It's been invisible, and this has caused so many problems within philosophy. And so he's trying to do all this work of stripping away all of the ontic layers of interpretation that have built up to be like, look, we're here. This is the question of being, and we have to clear all this stuff away before we can even really ask it.
I found the quote I was looking for on page 32 at the top. About halfway through that first paragraph, this is section 4, page 32. He says, scientific research is not the only manner of being which this entity can have, nor is it the one which lies closest. But the point is that it is a manner of being that this entity has, or at least can have, right? So we
can regard ourselves as objects.
Totally.
I'd like to respond. Can I respond to that?
Yes, please.
I don't think it's true. I think it's possible that Dasein might not be able to respond to itself as an object. Here's why. Because I think it depends on what we regard as Dasein. Whether our body is Dasein or not, or whether there's something else that is Dasein. Whether we could move back to something like a soul being Dasein, in which case the body would not be, if I was treating my body as present to hand, then I would not be treating Dasein as present to hand. So I think it's possible that Dasein cannot treat Dasein as presence to hand, that it can treat the body that we we relate to Dasein, that we relate to ourselves as an object. But I think it's possible that if we consider Dasein as something that's not perhaps physical or not our bodies, not identical to our bodies in any sense, that Dasein is not something that Dasein can treat as present to hand. I think that's a possibility. I'm not saying I agree with that, and that strikes me as too much of as too close to a dualism or something of the sort. But I think it's possible that Heidegger could take that sort of view. In which case, you would be correct in suggesting that Dasein cannot treat Dasein as present to hand, I think.
I think you're right, and I'm not sure though if that so I guess the quote I read though isn't saying that Dasein could encounter its own Dasein as present in hand. That's an interesting question.
And that's my question.
Right. Okay. Because
right, and that's what I thought that was the question.
Kind of being of the present in hand, this is one way of interpreting the world and ourselves. But as far as like Dasein itself is not typically this thing that anyone's. I mean, he's kind of coining it here and exploring it here. This is his process of formal indication. It's like this concept alone. So could Dasein render itself as present hand? That's more complicated.
Well, I think that the whole question that he's asking in the book can actually kind of bring us to that, because the central question is not what is Dasein, but who is Dasein, correct? He doesn't want to answer the question of what Dasein is, and that would suggest that Dasein is not something that we interact with as a what. And if that is the case, then it seems to be the case that Dasein is not something that we experience as present to hand.
Oh,
does that make sense?
Well, we can't experience. Well, okay. Here's just a really interesting thing I was thinking about. Couldn't we say that sort of disassociation, or sometimes certain types of breaks, mental breaks, where one feels like one's floating outside oneself or looking at one's actions without any sense of being in the body or being the agent. Those are not something that we would ever really say, oh yeah, no, that's just a normal way of being, right? That's a sign of some sort of dissociative split in the personality or the psyche. But it's possible. It's really, really weird, but it's possible to have an experience where you are looking at your own being as something that you're analyzing, and that's often a symptom of like a panic attack of schizophrenia
but in this case, sorry for interrupting, but aren't we already assuming what Dasein is, and that's something that like is tough to do? I think that might be the whole problem with this question, is that we're asking what you have to already assume what Dasein is in order to answer it. So I'm not sure we have an answer, but yeah.
I just a quick question for Jacob, right? Can I encounter other Dasein?
I don't know.
Right. I mean, because I mean the way you're characterizing it, I mean it's an important question. I think the point you raised is actually really good, right? So it recognized the fact that I was sort of equivocating on the notion that I was sort of equivocating a Dasein in the body, right, earlier, which is a good point. But nevertheless, given your characterization, my question then becomes something like, because you're kind of like on this, you're writing on this issue of dualism, right? And so if you say something like we can't, how do I put it, make our Dasein, or the Dasein that we are, right, objectively present, then in some sense, can we ever encounter another Dasein, right? Or is it just right? Is it this?
I would say yes, but
right?
we're not encountering other Dasein ontically. We're encountering other Dasein as Dasein, and the only way we can do that is because we're that kind of a being that is capable of having that kind of
I
relationship.
know, I think we can certainly encounter other Dasein as objects, as ontically, like we can distance ourselves in the sense of like analyzing them as if they're present to hand. But it's a really interesting question. Then, are we able to ever like experience other Dasein as they are, as their experience? Because we can't necessarily experience for them. And so,
well, I wanted to touch on that, is that, so on the one hand, I think that Jacob was spot on with this, the framing of the question. To answer it, will, oh, hello, welcome, Joel Bryant, to the conversation. Hey, yeah, welcome. We've got about 45 minutes to an hour left here, so we're about nearly 2 hours in. So for but anyway, Joel, we'll introduce you towards the end here actually. But for the time being, there should be a way to mute your microphone unless you are interjecting or offering a comment or question. And so best practices is we all mute our microphones if we're not talking. But yeah, welcome. Really glad to have you. And so going back to Jacob's question, is that yes, the framing of it's wrong, but this question about can we encounter other Dasein? That's yes, absolutely. We can, and this kind of gets at what you were talking about with the Martin Buber distinction between an I and an it and a thou. When Heidegger says the difference between Dasein and a substance with properties is the difference between a what and a who. And it would not really be a problem for Heidegger that we might be able to be deceived even by, let's imagine you thought that this bush was your friend and then you encountered it as a who. The fact that you can be deceived is really just, he talks about this in the introduction, that's sort of riding on the fact that you're generally not, right? And that Dasein, in its essence, as we'll find out later, is also always being with, right? Being with other Dasein in a world of Dasein.
Always in context.
But yes, we can definitely render an other as presence at hand. We can use another as an object. We can't, but our own Dasein, I don't think so. So let's. Yeah.
If no one else has anything to say on this particular topic, I do have some questions about some of the terminology that I just like to get figured out to make sure I know what I'm talking about. So the difference between, I don't know how to say them differently, but like existential, existential, and existentialia, I think. I'm not super clear on those. And the other thing was, I'd like to talk about inauthenticity, because I think I know what those are, but super certain that I have them distinguished. And the third is, I think it was mental ecology.
Wait, what?
Ecology.
Right.
Could be different from just ontology or something of the sort. So those terms, ones that kind of have a feeling I understand them, but I'm not quite certain.
Great. So I want to take this opportunity to really quick talk about our Google Drive folder, just because I'll be referencing a couple things in it right now. We have a partial glossary that is a collaborative document. You're able to add on to it, but we have a bunch of definitions for some words there. Then we have these 2 PDFs that we were able to get from Hubert Dreyfus's course, the lectures of which are on YouTube. Lydia was awesome enough to be able to track these down. And so I took the ones, one called the modes of being and the other one called structure of being in. And both of those are up in the folder in the extra resources. So I just wanted to make sure to make a plug for that because if people are using this, that's going to be awesome. But yeah, thanks for bringing it back to terminology because like that's the one thing that I definitely was hoping we could all touch on before this is over. So one thing that we'll want to do is go down the ontological difference and all of the jargon that it produces, because there's a lot of times in these first couple of chapters alone where Heidegger says, you know, this thing can be, you know, concern can be understood this way, concern can be understood this way, concern can be understood that way. We're going to say that it's none of those three, it's actually an existential of Dasein, upon which all of the other understandings of concern are subsisting. So, and he does that over and over again here. So he'll take something that might have a few meanings and then he'll say, but we're getting at that we're going to say that word, all the other understandings of that word are derivative of this other sense of the word, and that we will call an existential. And so the existential is the one that is spelled at the end of it. It has the I-A-L-E, existential, whereas there are also the existentials, and that's how I will say it at least. The existential has two L's at the end of it. And so separating those two out will be part of this, but also kind of like, what's the existential juxtaposed to? Does anybody offhand know what the existential is juxtaposed to?
Categories.
Right. Or so categories and properties apply to the world of things and stuff, the spatio-temporal world in the normal mathematical sense or scientific sense, the ontic. Whereas existentials will be the structures of the kind of being that Dasein has. So we will see that care is an existential. We will see that being in is an existential. Being with is an existential. And then I don't really want to unpack all those just yet because that's not so much the point as to say that there is this fundamental difference between, we've already been talking about it, on the one hand the ontic, on the other the ontological. Below the ontic side, we also have factuality, juxtaposed to, on the ontological side, facticity. Right? Facticity will be sort of existential facts about the being, the kind of being that Dasein has, whereas factuality will be more of like our normal sense of facts, our normal idea of what facts mean. Facts about the world of things and stuff. What is blue and why is the sky blue? Those are facts. That's facticity. Does anybody else have any of these, just offhand, because I have a list here that I can pull up, but does anybody else have the, some of the other words or jargon that falls on this differential line? So on the one hand, we have, oh yes, and going back to existentia, he doesn't refer to existentia, I don't think, a whole lot more than the first page, but basically what he's doing is showing you on the first page of the first chapter, he's taking out his ontological knife and he's making an incision between, well, there's this typical sense within which we understand cups have existence, and there's this other sense that we have existence. Our essence is in our existence, whereas this thing's essence is in what properties make it up, right? And so here he juxtaposes on the first page of chapter 1, juxtaposes properties that substances have to possibilities that Dasein has. right? So just going back to that fundamental distinction, we get existentia versus existence. Existence he's reserving for Dasein.
The ontic versus the ontological.
The ontic versus the ontological. The present in hand is on the ontic side.
Oh, just a quick question, because you talked about the difference between properties and possibilities. So I'm just wondering about possibilities, and this is maybe a silly question, but I'm wondering if possibility is similar to the general philosophical sense, or more in the way that Deleuze uses the term virtual.
So because we took that class together, I found the whole just the Deleuzian metaphysics to be super. Well, I find it helpful for thinking about Heidegger after having read Being and Time. But for those who weren't in that, I'll just say that, yeah, it's not something we can really unpack right now, but just as far as answering you goes, it's like saying that Dasein has a sort of ability to project into or gauge the virtual and bring it into extensity or actuality.
Yeah,
Right,
I would
so
say that, like, I'm thinking about facticity as if it's like the virtual, and that virtual is pushed forward into and actualized by Dasein. And I'm just wondering if it's like that, or if it's possibility as in like possible worlds, because that doesn't seem accurate.
Right, no. So it's not like possible worlds, and it is like what you just described. So the basic idea is that we are all, we can define this cup by its use value and by its properties, but we can't, going back to last week's example, we can't describe Brian's essence simply using the body in this room. You know, we would have to talk about what possibilities for this body have been actualized, which ones haven't been, which ones can be, which ones might be weighty on his mind, for instance. You know, that my possibilities are different than someone else's possibilities. This is what Heidegger is talking about when he will talk about thrownness.
Heidegger says.
Right, and in a
Hold on.
go ahead.
Joel say something?
Hi, Joel. Joel, I think we heard you for a second. No.
Oh, we didn't hear him.
Oh, that wasn't?
No, I said we didn't hear him. So, what? No, it's Lydia.
So
No, someone's talking.
I just wanted to, you were talking about facticity and so on, and Dasein. The thing about Dasein is never devoid. Dasein is never without a world, never without a it's never worldless, you know, in that sense, where that's what enables us to see objects as present to hand, is we can supposedly, when we're seeing them present to hand, we are taking them, they're kind of taken out of the world. We're just sort of taken on their own without context.
I'm sorry, I just wanted to really quickly, was someone talking right before Frank started talking? Because it sounded like that, but it might have been feedback. Oh, I suppose. Well, it just, Jacob said that's helpful. I thought he may have been responding to Lydia or someone else. Okay, sorry.
Yeah, no, I think, yeah, sorry, I think we got the technical thing worked out now. It looks like Joel muted it. Thank you. So we'll take the last half hour here, just to, so I basically gave a rough outline of the ontological difference and how it breaks down into the jargon that it does. And I think that when you find a word that's you're not sure if it's being used right, check the glossary, check the notes, the collaborative notes in the Google Drive. where I've made a table that help me fill that in if you can, where we're putting the stuff that falls on this divide. And then, yeah, I just wanted to say, like, we've got about a half hour left. So let's just make sure that anyone who hasn't had a chance to talk yet has an opportunity to pose any questions. And I'm going to kind of go through my notes and make sure that there's nothing like super important that got left out. But let's open it up.
I want to make sure that I've got a correct understanding of his terminology of the word averageness.
Oh yeah.
So can you kind of clarify? Because what I'm getting from that is that's more strictly like the ontical experience, and I don't know. I guess I'm struggling with the concept of this everyday averageness.
Awesome. Average everydayness is going to be really important. Actually, so in the introduction at some point, I believe, maybe someone else can help me out with this, but I think it was in the introduction that he says that the goal of this you know how he says proximally and for the most part a lot of the time, part of his goal for this cursory analysis, he says that this is like the very beginning of something that can be built on later, right? Is to come to an average, everyday, proximal, and for the most part, accurate analysis of Dasein's being in the world. Dasein's average, everyday existence being in the world, which is not so, yeah, no, it's not so much an ontical thing. When we think of averageness, we probably think of like bell curves and statistics, so it does sound ontical, but in this sense, it's more like he's trying really hard here to give an analysis of the basic way the Dasein is cross-culturally, which he admits is problematic. Like, I think within the first couple of chapters here, he says, yeah, maybe it's not going to be applicable everywhere, but what he is trying to do though is get at this average everyday understanding. And so I mean, one example of it, I'll just leave it at this example and turn it over so someone else can take over on this. But an example of an average everyday thing that we have all experienced, Heidegger would posit, is that we all experience idle chatter or idle talk. Like, which is to say, you're kind of talking about nothing. You're talking about the weather. You're saying, hi, how are you? But you're not really interested in how the person's doing. That's just something that we've all experienced. And we experience it on an average, everyday sort of basis.
Okay, I'm going to have to kind of put a word of caution. Okay, so because I've read, so Hubert Dreyfus wrote, who Dave refers to a lot, he just died, famous Heidegger scholar, right? But he wrote an essay on the internet and Kierkegaard and Heidegger, and he used this example of idle chatter, and Dave's used it in an essay that I've read before. So for me, for a while, I was like, yeah, average everydayness is it's bad, and then you like have to become authentic. That's not right. Well, at least that's not what Heidegger is getting at. But it's really easy to fall into this, like, well, we start at average everydayness, and then you get to exceptional, like, not everydayness, you know? So on page 76, that's the page where he talks about everydayness. He says that it's not a beginning stage simply to be over. Excuse me. It's not. This is my paraphrase. It's not a beginning stage simply to be overcome, but it's a mode of being. So, let's see. In this first paragraph, section 11, he says it's not identical to describing some primitive stage of Dasein, right? It's a mode of being, even when we're in a highly developed culture, right? And it's something that we can never actually, like, in a sense, overcome, right? because like, if we go back to page 68, which, I mean, you don't need to flip back there and look at it, but like he says that every day is it's not nothing, right? That it comes out when we are busy or excited or preparing to enjoy something or expressing interest. And so it's just sort of a mode, one mode of being. And
So I think I would be confused at this point though, because I wasn't talking about average everydayness in relation to authenticity and inauthenticity, which is you're right in bringing it into that. It's just that I haven't said anything about that yet. But yeah, so
just using the example of idle chatter, I thought would be enough to make people sort of have that association.
Right.
So I was trying to.
Right, and so it's good to tie it in at this point because it's going to be relevant, and it is now. So authenticity versus inauthenticity is something that Heidegger later catches a lot of flack for. It's something that I had a lot of reservations about coming into this text for the first time, and I think it's as Sammy points out, it's really easy to like we have kind of ideas about what those words mean already, and so they are really easy to get confused about. Like we think of, someone saying that this person's a poser and that person's not. And it's kind of like a juvenile sort of idea because, there was a point maybe when that had some relevance in the, I don't know what decade, but now it would be easy to be like, well, what's this authentic thing all about? Well, important to note is just that Heidegger says that nobody's ever fully authentic. That authenticity is just another way of being in the world, and that it's never like a full thing. Which is to say, like, I hold a pen the way everybody else holds a pen. I walk across the street the way everyone else walks across the street. I go to work the way everyone else goes to work. That's the average everyday way of being, and it wouldn't make sense to resist that even. Right? Whatever authentic would be is going to be something like taking a stand or a unique take on your own way, your own possibilities.
So it's a mode that is so for some people, perhaps being authentic might be blocked off maybe by a layer of interpretation, or I don't know. This is just theoretical. I don't know if I'm correct in saying this, but it might be a problem if you can't access an authentic mode of being. Kind of like in the way that we were just discussing, where it's possible maybe never fully possible, but it's possible to encounter other Dasein in an ontic sense, right? Or it's possible for us to encounter like our bodies or something in an ontic sense. That's just one possibility though, right? But or like knowledge is a mode of being, right? But it's been mistaken as the primary and foundational mode of, or the primary and foundational like being that underlies everything else. So therefore it has blocked off all of these other modes in such a way inauthenticity, if it's just assumed that that's all there is, it can block off maybe authenticity as a way of being. But you're never going to, like, knowledge still is a mode of being, inauthenticity is still a mode of being. You're not going to eliminate them. It's not like this like sort of linear structure. But if they are supposedly the only thing, you don't think that's correct?
Oh, I don't. I think we should couch it mostly until we get there, because it's really at this point, I just can't see why this isn't going to be more confusing.
Well, Jacob asked about authenticity.
Right. Which for now, all you need to know about authenticity is that it's built. It's this thing that is kind of below that sort of phenomenon we experience, that you could be true to yourself, or that you could have a unique opportunity or possibility that others don't have. But that's basically it. The main point that Sammy, I think, is trying to convey is that it's not a moral thing, and that Heidegger's he says it multiple times. He's not trying to moralize this. Whereas the common sense conception we have of inauthentic would be, oh, that's less good. Whereas that's silly, because there's nothing less good about using a pen the way other people use a pen. Does that make sense, Jacob?
Yeah, yeah, it's good. I just remember on authenticity and inauthenticity in a class I took on Heidegger way back, and I couldn't really quite remember the difference between the two.
And then Kristen, did that answer what your question about averageness?
Yeah, I think so. Thanks.
I will say I still have questions about authenticity versus inauthenticity. I understand that this isn't a moralizing thing. I understand that entirely. I just don't understand the difference between the two, frankly, because I mean, he spends a whole paragraph on it and moves on. So I understand there are two different. It's page 68, and that's kind of what I assumed reading through this was that I didn't have to, because I know everyone talks about authenticity with Heidegger, so if it only came up for a paragraph, it'll be back.
Oh, right.
But on 68, where to go? As modes of being, authenticity and inauthenticity, these expressions have been chosen terminologically in a strict sense, are both grounded in the fact that any Dasein whatsoever is characterized by minus. But the inauthenticity of Dasein does not signify any less being or any lower degree of being. So right there, he's saying it's not a moral thing. You know, it's just these are two modes of Dasein. I just don't understand. Maybe it's not time to understand that distinction.
Right. I would say you have to wait. Right. So really, authenticity begins to really get cashed out towards the end of Division 1 and Division 2. Really, you really have to get the issue, the sort of his relationship to the concept of death and how Dasein relates to its own death, right? To really think about authenticity. Yeah.
I just wanted to make one brief comment about the average everydayness as well, because I think Heidegger doesn't want us to fall into this idea that the most valuable frame of mind or whatever is when we're contemplating the nature of being, but rather, the sort of everyday getting along with life, doing what we need to do to, survive, prepare our food, do our job, and so on. That is no less valuable in our human experience as a way of understanding what it means to be in the world. So it's not like the only only good thing is contemplating. He's also wanting, I think, to validate and value, the sort of way that we conduct our lives, most of the time. And this was reflected in the fact that he saw himself as being very close to the common man, very close to the peasant, admired, their kind of unselfconscious simplicity.
Oh, that's actually really helpful, I think. Just, yeah, so that in that, if there is a distinction to understand now, first of all, it's just that understanding the average everydayness of Dasein's experience in the world is just as valuable, especially at this point, that is one way that we do understand the world. It's just through the average everyday experiences. So therefore, we're going to have to be able to look through that in order to understand what it is that Dasein does better before we can even go beyond and start thinking about being and as being down all that rabbit hole.
I think it's also a way of going away from the philosopher's tendency to always take extreme cases and then deduce things from it. And he's trying to say, no, let's take the average everyday case,
yes,
and then build up from there.
Philosophers are so far behind.
I have a question that's similar to this, I think, passage. And I know we went over it, but I'm having trouble with alongside, being in the world and being alongside and dwelling as being both belonging and sort of and participating, but not being strictly spatial. And it's the relation of never touching, but being, I don't know how to say it, worlded. I'm really having problems with that, because in the end, it seems really related, but also isolated. So I just I don't have a good sense of feeling what those things are.
That's a big question.
Yeah, no, Lydia, I'm really glad you brought that up. I forgot
That
about
is-
it. I'm confused about it too.
That is this is not an answer to, or an attempt to answer the question, but I think one of the things that is trying to get at is that we cannot really separate the world as an object for our contemplation or whatever, because we're in it. And so I want it to be clear that being alongside is not the same as being present at hand with something. He's trying to make some distinction. I'm not clear exactly what that is, but he does seem to be trying to make a distinction there. Maybe someone else can clarify that a bit.
Lydia, are you referencing what's found on, for example, pages 82 and maybe 81?
Yeah, 81 and 82.
Or are you referencing page 88 when he's talking about it's like the tarrying alongside and then fascination and all these other things?
Yeah, thank you. I was just now looking at 81, 82, but before I was looking at 89. So, and honestly, this question is really behind my initial rejection of Heidegger, as in spite of all the contextuality that resonates, there's an aspect of isolation that, or a sort of fundamental individuality or unit by unit, so the Daseins don't seem to get together very well, and like the who-ness that's sort of anthropomorphic. It's necessarily just people get to be who's, and so there's a kind of almost a merger. I don't want to say merger. I want to use the phrase primary narcissism, but people will misunderstand me if I use that phrase. A sense of feeling with and almost at one with the world, or immersed in it, but also therefore in your own kind of bubble in a way. So I don't know that was clarifying by just saying that more, but that's what I'm grappling with.
Maybe, is there a specific sentence or a phrase that gives you the impression of this, like, despite all of the contextuality isolation that you're talking about?
You know what? Honestly, it's just terminology, I think. And so, let's see. Okay, let's look to. I have to kind of take I'm starting at 79. Okay, 80. 80, so the top of 80. I'm sorry, I don't have an easy answer for you, so I'm just going to walk you maybe step by step. So he's thinking about being in, and that's to reside, to dwell. I'm accustomed, I'm familiar with, I look after something. Oh, I'm like all excited. This is like habitus and care and belonging, and okay, great. That's what in means. And then I reside or dwell alongside the world as that which is familiar to me. So he's introducing alongside now. And to me, alongside is confusing, because it means not touching or not a part of, or it means distinct in a parallel configuration. So I'm just confused by alongside. And then I have to think, well, maybe what he means is that not, maybe simply what he means is something simply distinct, just a kind of distinction, so that you have enough distance to respect relationality. It's not one-to-one or immersion or something like that. So I'm like, okay, I'm a little confused, but I'm ambivalent about this alongsideness, but I'm going to try to go with it as a kind of respectful togetherness that's not invasive. Okay, but then we get to this phrase down in the next paragraph, being alongside the world, in the sense of being absorbed in the world. I'm like, oh shit, okay, the distinction just got eliminated. So now the world is really engulfing me, and I'm like, oh, that is like a kind of primary merger. And it makes sense. Being in would make sense to be absorbed in the world. But what he really means is attention. Like my attention is absorbed, I think, but that's just a little something else. Okay, so then down on paragraph 55, page 1.5, it's like paragraph 56, I guess. There is no such thing as the side-by-sideness of an entity called Dasein with another entity called world. Okay, that's where the thing, I forget who just spoke when they clarified that there's no way to get out of your world in order to be next to it. Okay, great. But I was still confused with the difference between alongside and side-by-side. Side-by-side maybe means like entities, like individuals, and alongside is closer to like a dwelling that maybe has a distinction or something. I know, I'm sorry, I'm babbling still, but I think that, and then we get to the wall thing and can never touch without a world.
So Lydia, really quickly, I wanted to ask if you have all of the footnotes in your translation.
Oh, I do. I just didn't read them.
Okay, so that I would recommend reading footnote 3 then, because they, so it's like the preposition by, like on, does not have the semantic. Okay, wait. Are alongside, with which we shall translate it when other devices seem less satisfactory, especially in the phrase being alongside, sein bei, is often quite misleading. The sense here is closer to that of at, in such expressions as at home or at my father's. So he's relying back. I'd really recommend reading the footnotes. Sometimes they'll be all in German or they'll be kind of pointless, but a lot of them will be illuminating. And so if you look at footnote 1 on this page, it's in regards to innen, wohnen, and bauen, build, and all these German words. And it's pointing out that Heidegger is relying on Grimm's kleinere Schriften, and this is how he connects all these things. So that might answer your question, which seems sort of semantic.
The other thing I'd add there is just that, my professor for this class went back to the original German, and just basically it was like everyone in this class, from now on, when you see the word alongside, when it's like this, scratch it out and write amidst or absorbed, because it's just ultimately a bad translation. They thought that they had to compromise in some way, but ultimately it's misleading because of the connotations that you're pointing out. So yeah, I mean, it's because otherwise it's super confusing. It's we should think more like, and when you raise a good point about absorbed too, is that about attention? This is all precognitive, if we want to use that terminology, which he would not want to use, but it's I'm absorbed in this environment, even in this room. I'm absorbed in my world in all sorts of ways that are beyond my attention, right? So my professor used the example of, he said that when we say being in the world, we should think of in like salt and water, or we should think, instead of like, sugar cubes in a cup, we should think of salt in water. It's a complete.
Being in solution, although it's also absorbed too.
Yeah, you're right. The other part being that.
Wait, what was that? I missed it.
So being absorbed as in a solution, a chemical solution.
Ah, okay.
And then on page 157, which is obviously jumping way ahead, there's just this part, and you don't have to turn there really, but he's being with is one of the existentials. So I mean, it takes him a few chapters to build up to this, Lydia. But you're right. At this point, it's like, what is this bubble? Where are the others? Can they really be encountered? There's a whole chapter though where he's building up, like, because of these other things we said, like an a priori necessary existential facticity about this being is it's being with, and even the fact, the factuality that you could be is based on the facticity that you are necessarily always being with.
You're always in the world somewhere, even if it's not a very highly populated. As in, there may not be a lot of objects immediately around you, but you're never out of the world.
You still have billions of grains.
Yeah, right.
Okay, thank you. That was very helpful.
Yeah, thanks for digging into that one, because that one is especially confusing.
Yeah, it did get me too. I kind of, after reading the footnote, I was like, oh, okay, it's just like a weird German thing.
Hey, I got to get going, guys, but thanks for everything. I really appreciate it.
Bye,
I look
Andy.
forward to seeing you next time, Andy. Take care.
Bye.
Let's spend the next 7 minutes wrapping down before we talk about sort of structural stuff for the next conversation for next week about, yeah, so just if people want to be a part of that conversation, that'll kind of commence at 9 o'clock. But until then, we've got about 7 minutes if anyone has any more questions or comments.
I did want to make one comment about one of the statements that was made at the very beginning, kind of talking about the grounding of Heidegger and Heidegger's points of departure and Kant. And obviously, I don't want to go too far, afield in that, but I think one of the, kind of basic things there is, Kant's famous statement that being is not a predicate. Beings, can have things predicated to them, but being itself or being as being is not. It's not a predicate. It's kind of a possibility for there to be beings. And in the same way, then it's not a category of existence. Dasein also is not a or being Dasein. It's not in a technical sense. It's not a predicate. It's not a category. It's not a category of being. It's kind of the possibility of being.
So when you say predicate, you don't mean verb. What do you mean by predicate?
In other words, the way that Kant is using it, he's not like saying, one of the things that I can use to describe this thing, it has being. He is repudiating that use of the.
It's not a property?
No, being is not a property.
Yeah.
It's not a property, it's not a category, because he says that we enter into contradiction then, saying, so what? There's a category of beings that are and a category of beings that aren't. It doesn't, that doesn't make sense. So it's not, it doesn't, it's not functioning as a descriptor or a category among other categories. It's the thing that we have a hard time talking about that makes all of those categories and descriptions and essences and accidents and all of that possible. But it's not itself a predicate.
To give some context to this in relation to Kant, right? This arises in relation to Descartes and the whole issue about God's existence, right? And so, of course, Descartes and also, Anselm and other theologians are going to say something like the property of existence is necessarily entailed and the proposition that God is or is a perfect being, right? So to be
because Kant undermines the ontological argument.
Right. So the ontological argument goes something like, you know, it in the proposition or in saying that God is a perfect being, that necessarily entails that God exists, right, or has being in some way, right? And so that's to say something like existence or being is a property or a predicate that you can predicate of a subject. In this case, the subject is going to be God, right? So he's disputing that. Kant is, at least, right?
Yes.
But the issue for Heidegger and how this relates to Heidegger in some way is to say something like, well, if you say that being is a predicate or a property, that's necessarily presupposing something. You're not really getting the answer, right? You're how do I put it? The best way that I can put it is that you're kind of going in this infinite regress, right? You're explaining what is by saying that it's just a property. But what about that property itself, right? You're going to continually go in this kind of circle, ontologically speaking, right? At least from the Heideggerian perspective, that's what he wants to say, is that you're not really addressing ontology in this kind of proper way. You're just explaining existence away in this kind of other ontic sense, right? You're not really getting at an ontology. You're just explaining existence in terms of this ontic sense of properties, right? Which is why he also has a problem with the analytic tradition's response to this, which is going to say something like existence is not a first order property, existence is a second order property, right? It's a property of properties, right? And that's going to be the Fregean and Russellian and the whole sort of analytic tradition is going to say something like this, and it's going to be cashed out in their sort of first order logic. So yeah, anyways, that gives maybe more history to that issue than needed, but yeah.
That's actually really helpful. Yeah.
I also wanted to throw into the mix, just because this was a good opportunity. It reminded me of something important that is really confusing. It's at least for me, the way I was reading this text, it's so confusing at first. Sometimes being is uppercase, sometimes it's not. And you have to know that it should never be uppercase, and that it has nothing to do with how we normally in philosophy uppercase anything. So
Germans love capitalizing.
It's a German thing, yeah. It's Germans uppercase nouns, and so the translators also uppercase Dasein, and it shouldn't be uppercase either. When I write it out, I always do it uppercase just because it's a habit, but you're not really supposed to. Like if you were writing a paper that you're going to submit somewhere, don't uppercase Dasein, and definitely don't uppercase being when you're talking about the being of beings. You shouldn't even be uppercasing it then. And because to do so invokes like God, the ultimate being, and it's sort of that.
What about the ground of being? Don't we want to capitalize?
Yeah, you would think so, you know, and it would almost make it easier, but the scholarship is definitely not, you know, says no. That was a mistake in translation.
How do you basically tell between beings and being, and that one is singular, one is plural.
That's it.
Yeah, and it's easy to think of. I mean, for a long time, I was confused about Heidegger being obsessed with the question of being with a capital B, because I was like, what even is that? Like, it just makes it seem like another thing, but it's not. It's being, not being. Yeah.
Which is
useful.
Yeah.
Oh, Foxy making a big deal out of this for. Right.
Not adding a special category. I think that's an important thing.
Right. This is not a platonic form of being. What is the highest genus or whatever? No. It's the opposite of that. So, or maybe I don't know if I can even say that. Any closing? I guess we're a minute past. So before kind of throwing down around a few ideas for this, just any final closing comments about this reading and discussion itself? Cool, and people are hanging out still. So anyway, I would like to just reiterate that one way of doing it was to have a person roadmap, and it seems too difficult to do that, especially with Heidegger. I mean, when Brian and I each did that with Sister, it was way too much talking for either one of us to stomach. So the thing we tried on the third Saussure reading was we had Lydia, Julie, myself, and Brian all each take a certain segment of the next reading, and each of us generated some questions for that. Yeah, which that seems like a starter, but I just wanted to say, hey, does anyone have any other ideas that they want thrown around? And at this point, really this is just put ideas out there. It's not let's debate ideas. It's just put them out there.
I would say generating questions, I agree with Frank, for all sorts of philosophical reasons is really superior to trying to explain any section of the text as if you are an authority on the text, when maybe it's just your first time reading it, and no one ever truly will be the authority on that section. So generating the questions and maybe some of the expounding of those questions and working through those questions, I feel will always be helpful in creating, number one, less of a feeling of imposter syndrome, and fewer imposters, right? So it's not I read this 3 times, so I get to tell everybody what this is about. It's more I read this, and these were the things that stuck with me. These were the resonances. These were the questions that popped into my head, and I think they'll be helpful, so I'm sharing with them with the group.
Agreed. I don't even want to try to be an imposter with Heidegger. Thank God. At the end of the day, what's been helpful to me so far in this conversation, the last one we were talking about, just the introduction in general, was the questions, and being that there's a lot of terminology, the defining of terminology, which we do have everything in the Google Drive to help that, but oftentimes the conversations and getting more concrete examples out of that we end up with is incredibly helpful. So maybe if we did do something that incorporates maybe questions and then terminological unraveling a little.
Yeah.
And
another ideas that sparked, it makes you think of this, as an example.
Right.
Illuminating by example.
I think a question model works, similar to what me and David had in that Deleuze class we took together, where one person and we could do multiple people just come up with questions every week, because I think it does really help, especially if you don't feel like you have a good sense of exactly what's going on. Questions are always something that you can ask them, and I just think it makes for a better discussion anyway. And I think that this sort of format with the online and face-to-face stuff is best suited for a discussion format more than a lecture format. I always find myself in a lecture format kind of getting sidetracked and getting distracted on, I don't know, a discussion seems to work better for me anyway.
So there might be a couple more in the mix or cooking. And so I'll just really quick say, the first reading was these first 2 chapters. That was the shortest reading we'll probably have in the rest of this text. If you have not seen the syllabus, please look at the syllabus. But the next, it has the reading schedule. The next one is chapter 3. It's not as short as the 2 previous chapters. So it's about 50 pages, and it's going to be. This is where it really kicks into gear, and there are parts of this that I'm really looking forward to talking about, because I'm still so confused about some. I mean, some of the most confusing stuff is the stuff I want to understand more than anything else. So really, for me, for instance, that's going to be all this stuff about signs. I want to know. So there are 10 sections in chapter 3. There might be, Andy already left. I know we have people coming next week who weren't here this week. Should I try to divvy that up between people as far as Yeah, generate questions.
To bring questions. I think that's a good idea.
Well,
Could it be a volunteer basis?
Yeah, volunteer basis. I just part of that, and I trust that everyone here wouldn't take advantage of this because, like, I mean, this is a very voluntary class. We don't have to take it for credits, but sometimes in academic classes, when reading or questions got assigned, like based on certain sections, it'd be like, oh, that person gets to read the first chapter and bring questions, okay, and then I have to read the 10th. That means I have to read all the chapters, and they don't. So just be mindful of that, like.
Or,
I don't know, maybe.
just as a random, have everyone bring 3 questions. When I was at St. John's, they would run those discussions. As you always started with an opening question, and then when that finished, other people brought whatever their opening question was. So
it seems like we only needed 1 question to start everything off today. A lot of prodding.
Also, another thing might be that if we let people organically just bring questions, not based on each section, there are some sections that might be easy to understand and need fewer questions. And there might be ones that we're all just like drawn to because they're really confusing. So perhaps instead of assigning and divvying up, I mean, we could try that, like for one section, like for one seminar, right? We could also try just having everybody bring a question or a couple questions.
What do the rest of you think about that? I kind of like that idea.
I really like that idea.
It sounds good to me.
So basic takeaway for now is just everyone do chapter 3 and come up with a couple questions, right?
Okay, hold on. I'm silent not because I don't have an opinion, but I just don't know what my opinion is yet. So I'm really interested in really kind of thinking through the pedagogy of the reading group. And I don't have any concrete suggestions or even a framework. I just know that it's a live question for me. And so I really am sort of actively, existentially wondering about what it is that we are doing together and why and how. So I'm wondering those things, and I don't have any answers or suggestions.
So are you saying that you think perhaps the way we divvy up responsibility for the text, or the way that the discussion goes, the way that we structure things, should be related to our intention, and we should all be at least explicit, even if we're not on the same page, at least explicit in what our intentions are in being part of this reading group?
I'm not saying that because I don't know that intentions are something that are explicitly knowable and maybe don't matter, are not a question of knowledge, consciousness, or will. So I think desire might be more accurate description, but that also is elusive. And I also know that the nuts and bolts are basically things emerge when you show up and do the thing, whatever the thing is, in this case, read and talk. So but I feel that this conversation must evolve. I mean, this conversation must be revisited and must evolve, or we will be fundamentally alienated from one another in the process. So we are not graduate students. We are not all at the same point of entry in our attachment or desire for the text. I have a hostile relation to the text, so I can't really set an example, but I can be led by the desire and the example mentorship of other people's engagement. And those things are, I won't say intangible, but I will say those things emerge in relation, emerge in the being with and the being in, I guess, that the the conversation is for us as a world. And so I guess I'm just asking for attention. I'm asking for attention and thoughtfulness about process and participation. And that's not to say that what we're doing isn't fine. It's to say that I believe what we're doing is the thing. And if we don't reflect upon what the thing is as we're doing it, we will lose it. It is elusive, so it will leave us, and we will leave each other without having known that we were close to the thing.
So okay, so it's more like everybody be aware of this and
we can certainly
think about it,
even after the next session too. Perhaps it would be useful to take some time to reflect on what we liked about the process, or what worked in the process, a chance to revisit that conversation. I'm certainly open to that.
Same. So like we have action, right? And we're not going to be able to stall ourselves in deciding what the best action is, because there's no real way to know everybody's intention, and there's no real way to figure out what the best thing is without doing, right? But
Yeah.
there should be space for reflection, and like allowance of reflection as we proceed, right?
Space for reflection. It needs to be somewhat organic and somewhat structured. So it's not, again, with the intention thing, I just don't trust my own knowledge of my own intentions. I can't necessarily participate in intentional discussion about intentions. But for example, it occurs to me that story. As we are just getting the nuts and bolts of comprehension, that is insufficient in the long view. And what I need from you are your stories about how this works or doesn't work in your life. And so instead of like general or vague impressions about its truth or non-truth, like a specific example or story that resonates. And if we had just one story a session, that would be so rich and wonderful, and we would have the thing, I think, if we heard each other's stories in that way.
Because yeah.
I want to see if anyone else wants to add to it.
I like that. I'm certainly open to that.
I think that what you're saying right now, Lydia, is a really primary concern for me that I had a lot of anxiety about in relation to not only this reading group, but in relation to the possibility of that being a possibility. Like, can there be a group that comes together, a community, maybe not intentional community, but a community that can come together around a goal and not just focus on, like, for instance, comprehension and like sort of devouring of the text. Like, we want to know Heidegger and what he really was saying, and then we're going to finish the text and that's it. But like, why is that goal, and why are these other goals of being in this group worthwhile to our everyday lives? And I think that's a very Heideggerian, that there's a Heideggerian spirit to that question.
Average everydayness.
Well, and I think that the spirit of that question is really essential.
Well, the spirit of the question is who?
Mm-hmm.
So who the fuck are you? Is an aggressive way to say, why should I care what you think? And who can we be together? And the locatedness, the worldness of the Turtle Island mission or vision was all about that. It was all about this particular location is not the best location, the only location, an ideal location, a model location. It's just the one that we have. And because we have it, because it's the one that is of concern in this moment, it's of a great personal concern, a familial, traditional, embedded world that we've decided through friendship, through mutual love and respect and interest, embrace that piece of locatedness that is, because that is the only locatedness that ever is that it's almost random and almost destined at the same time, that we are where we are, that we inhabit where we inhabit, that the people that are with us are the people that are with us. It's random, and also it's all that. And that fact, the fact of our accident inevitability being together, is a location and a particular embrace of that location can provide. And so that's what drew me to this group. And I'm really interested in how the internet works with and against this, and the sort of embeddedness of me here in my apartment in New Jersey, feeling disembodied from my immediate surroundings because I'm with a group that is in multiple places already, but what I see most is the living room of somebody in Boise, Idaho. It means that I'm better off than if I were reading by myself, but I don't necessarily feel that locatedness and the stories that we would have had together if we'd been, you know, doing what you guys are doing in your daily jobs together. So I don't even know if you guys are working together for money anymore, but when you were permascaping or whatever, I felt like there's this missed opportunity for everyone to sort of feel the same muscle memory or experience as part of the text. And that's what I'm looking for. I'm looking for some shared experience that goes with the reading, the understanding.
Yeah, can I say it?
Yeah.
You bring up a lot of points that are very important, I think, to me, and that I know. A point you made is that we're here kind of talking about this stuff. I know Dave and I are having this conversation almost every day, and Sammy's been out of the country for a while, but also now that she's back, this, you know, like we're all kind of having this. And you're right to point out that technology really is helping us do this thing here right now, but it also makes connection a lot harder. Because I mean, at the risk of sounding very cold, I don't get close to people easily. That's just part of me. And then you put the technological thing in between it, and it's so much harder, right? And I know that we have every intention to not only read these books together, but to like develop a bond. And I think with technology, it's gonna be a slower process. I think because we're 3,000 miles away and we meet 2 hours every week, that is harder, and because our intention begins with Heidegger in this case. It begins there, and regardless of wanting to get to know each other on more interpersonal levels, to help get through this more easily, that's a very difficult thing to do in the time frame. So maybe a thing to also think about is within this group, yes, there's the initial objective, clearly, that I know I have of reading through this and understanding. In the whole context of what we're doing as an organization, there is a community building at the center. But it's hard for me at this point, and I want to keep having this conversation, I really do. But it's hard for me to say that this necessarily has to or can be that in that way. But I want to leave that open because there is no, for me at this point, there is no like it can't be. I just with the things in between us, such as technology, space, time, it's a difficult task.
I wanted to add, so if it is difficult and if that is something we want to at least be open to having alongside or with reading the text, because like Lydia, you said you wanted to have these stories and this connection that somehow were appropriate to, or that that integrated themselves, that became part of the text. Like, you know, when you're driving along a certain stretch of road and you look, you see a building, you're like, and you know, you remember when you're doing something with someone at that place, like, it is always forever embodied in the text of that building. And there's a sense that we want to have this sort of experience that is layered into this text for us together, and then that this text is layered into our experience of each other. And I wholeheartedly agree, and I also acknowledge that there are these difficulties of distance and of the fact that the beginning of this particular part of the organization was, we want to read this text. But I think what is essential to keep in mind, if we want to at least be open to that possibility, is that nobody in this group should be replaceable necessarily in the end. Like, you know, when we've traversed this together, there should be, and I'm sure you've all, if you've been to college or maybe even in high school, experienced those sorts of classes which really change you, or that you really remember lastingly, and that there always seem to be, at least at the beginning, a few people who were exterior to that group, who didn't care or didn't put in the effort or never participated. And I think the mark of a really excellent professor and an excellent atmosphere of class was that I have memories of a few of these classes where at the end, you knew everybody's name, and even the ones who didn't participate a lot, they felt essential to the atmosphere of that class. They felt essential to the experience of that class, right? And it was because even if there were difficulties and blockages to that particular person, for example, if there's a blockage of these people who are, you all who are accessing this room, and we are accessing your rooms online, right? The professor who was leading the class, or like the other students in the class, were cognizant in a way of that difficulty and made space for, extra space for maybe that person. So I guess what I'm trying to say is that I think it's possible to not just be like, well, it's difficult, so it shouldn't really be an option. It's like, it's almost more of a learning opportunity for us to try to give you, for example, more space, or to try to form personal connections with everybody and allow space for the stories, the who's, not just the, well, there's a bunch of atoms together and they're all focused on this text, right? It's like, no, there's a bunch of unique individuals, and them coming together creates a specific atmosphere and a specific experience and event that becomes integrated with the text as the text becomes integrated with them.
So I think that stipulating these desires for what will come out of this process is good, because I think it will help the people who are still with us and who might watch later and then join realize that you can make the examples in the text about your personal life or tie it in somehow. You could contextualize yourself into the group a little bit more. I think Brian's point is more about like, well, we only have so much time to actually get through the thing. I guarantee you next week we will not have had enough time in those 2.5 hours to do the 50 pages justice. Turtle Island's not about community building. It's about community building through hard work and rigorous study. And there's community building groups everywhere. So it's like, I just want to like make sure to drive home that like, yes, absolutely, let's make sure that when you are engaging, and I think that this goes to anybody who feels this. You don't, I mean, for instance, let's just take any person who's listening right now who hasn't said anything. Let's just say that you don't want to really do that. Well, you don't have to, but if you do, then totally do it. You know, infuse yourself into the thing. Also, but I also really want to encourage people to reach out individually and friend people that are in this group through the Facebook Messenger or through the emails, and to strike up one-on-one relationships as well. Because at least for me, the best relationships I have had come out of classes were because I said, man, this was really good, but I'm still really confused about this. Do you want to talk about this? Do you want to get coffee? And just because you are on the East Coast, or doesn't mean that we can't get coffee, right? Because I've gotten coffee with people or gotten beers with people through video or over the phone. And so I definitely highly like encourage that. You know, I think that's and the fact that it's being expressed here, I think should hopefully encourage other people to be like, oh, that is something that can come out of this.
Okay, so I'm sorry, I got feedback. Dave, you really like triggered something for me there in a negative way. When you articulate that the point of Turtle Island, here, I'm going to turn on my face for this since I'm saying something negative. You can look at me directly and direct some aggression if necessary.
Okay.
It really triggers something when you say the point of Turtle Island is not community building, it's community building through hard work and rigorous study. When you have not disagreed with the fundamental point being building community and the fact that the original vision includes shared space, shared work, shared study. So doing it together was actually always the point. So I don't understand why we or you are feeling that the parameters of time and space are such that they will not allow shared work and common study. So I'm not suggesting we meet for longer. I'm suggesting that there are ways to share work and study that are not within that are maybe part of our imaginations or intentions, right? That developing an intention of, well, this week I'm really going to think about the concept of world as I'm driving the work. I'm going to like think about what I'm going to try to experience something about what it means to be immersed or whatever it is. Or when I next go to do my job, my labor, I'm gonna like think about the technology that's, you know, a prosthetic, and I'm gonna think about the other Daseins in the room and what that relationship is like. So I just feel like there are ways that we can be experiential and we can be exploring community that do not deplete our time and resources, but enhance the reading experience.
Fair enough. I don't think that what I said excluded that possibility.
I just feel this resistance from you, and I can't figure out why.
It's for anybody who read the 6-page letter that this is all a response to multiple times and thought about it for the last month. It's more about that. And so I don't know. I wonder at this point what an outsider perspective might look like for, say, Jacob, Isaiah, Joel. There's someone. Oh, Kristen. So I don't really. I feel like what I've said is open enough to exactly what you're talking about. Anyone can do any of those things and still do that in the group. I think that's totally okay. I adjusted the emphasis for myself and my own interest in being in here, and
I think I have some illumination that I want to avoid getting too personal because. Jacob has something.
I wonder if there's a semantic divide here, that you guys seem to be talking over one another, because I don't think that there's really that big of a disagreement between you, David, and Lydia, because I think that Lydia, what you're describing, that wrestling with the work throughout your week and wrestling with what it means to the world throughout your week, that strikes me as a rigorous undertaking with the text. I think what David might be responding to is, and I don't know what letter you're referring to, so maybe this is what you're referring to, is people showing up to class and not having read the text, or just wanting to learn without putting in the work of having read those 50 pages, which I don't think is what you're expressing. So I'm just, there just seems to be a divide between what the two of you are saying, and there doesn't seem to be that much of a difference. I don't know if that's helpful at all, but
I think that I agree completely with that.
Well, I would like to. Well, actually, Lydia, I'll let you respond, but I do have something to say afterwards.
Even Dave, just now when you said if people want to do this, that's fine. And I think, well, that's great that you think that that's fine. We are talking about processes that could involve everyone, and why not just say, hey, let's try this for a week or whatever. I'm not even saying my idea, but I don't understand why you're not actually just jumping at something, anything to like be in the world and be less in isolation. And so it's not a content thing, I think, as much as I wish to encourage your spirit or something like that. Like, yeah, we're isolated, and yeah, work is hard, and that's not why should we put up with that?
So what I wanted to say in response to all of this is, I just knowing some of the experiences or people or groups that have been encountered by people in this organization, including Dave or myself, there are, let's just say, a lot of permaculture groups who put this emphasis on community, but there's no real qualifiers for joining the community other than, like, you know, I don't know, like, you know, care about the earth and want to come to our events and, like, you know, plant stuff. And it's there's not a spirit of seriousness or rigor, and and consequently many of these groups fall apart or lose members, and have a lot of difficulty actually accomplishing their objectives because of the lack of quote unquote seriousness, because it doesn't, in the end, it fails to speak to each individual who's part of the group. The objective or the way the group is run fails to speak to the lived experience of each life in that group in a way that they want to continue with it. And I think there's a danger, though, of pushing into, like, let's imagine two poles. There's like, oh, loosey-goosey, anything goes. You will experience this in university with classes where the professor clearly is just trying way too hard to be a friend or doesn't care, right? And then everyone loses interest because there's not enough seriousness. Everyone ends up making excuses, and no one will take the topic or whatever seriously. But then you have the professors who afterwards, everyone's like, that professor was an asshole. I hated that class, and I checked out, not because it was not interesting or because there wasn't enough rigor, but because the professor was being too hard on us, or the spirit of the class was discouraging and it was overwhelming. So there's like overwhelming and underwhelming, where you don't care or have no interest because it doesn't make an impact on your life, or where the course is trying to make so much of an impact on your life or trying so hard to push one way of being, like where the professor expects you to read hundreds of pages a week in undergraduate studies, and you're like, I can't meet the qualifications to be truly part of this group. And it feels very elitist, where the other one feels like it has no boundaries or containers at all. And I think we want to be very careful about not pushing people who are oriented slightly to one or the other side, pushing each other into extremity. I think this happens a lot with political groups and such, where it's just like a person who's maybe slightly more on this side looks at the person on this side and says, oh, you're over there, so I'm gonna move more over here. And so there's, like, in that sense, some of the groups we've encountered, there might have been experiences that cause a sort of push towards more seriousness and more exclusion, I guess. But I do feel that it's not necessary to react in that way. And once one's cognizant of the possibility of reacting in that way, you can be like, okay, no, it's not just that, like, all those, you know, I don't know.
I'll just, I really like that you did bring that. And so I guess, Lydia, that, not that, yeah, in my head, I guess everyone's on the side of my head. I suppose that you aren't, for instance. And so, so that's probably really helpful, because, like, yeah, my experiences from the last 7 months of organizing in this group has been that there's always these people coming in who are really, like, lit on an impression they have of what we're trying to do, and often these people like to hear their thoughts a lot, and then I, as a person who's been the one organizing things and trying to get people set up if they wanted to participate and so that they could take on responsibilities as well, I often found myself having a lot of conversations that go on for even months sometime about process before the person's done anything. And so it's really just like, well, let's make sure that like whatever the stated objective is also kept in mind. But like I think Sammy's right to make like that my attitude should not be like polarized from that. But yeah, I mean, so if it's a work thing, because really what the organization's about is about practice and theory, about bridging cognitive and physical labor. So it's about the idea that ivory tower academics getting their hands dirty and agriculture folk who want to cultivate the life of the mind in a more academic environment, like being able to bridge that, because there is that strikes a chord with some people, and some people go like, that's something I want to do. But sometimes, it's just like, you'll get a person who's like, I really like that idea, but then like, well, they don't, or they get distracted. But there's lots of reasons, and they're legitimate. And it's not like, oh, we're trying to be exclusionary in the sense of just like, if this isn't your thing, we don't like you. It's not like that. It's just like, well, but because we have gone through like the last 7 months of people who come on and then like say that it turns out they actually don't like the work side, or they don't want to do the academic thing. I think Jacob's example is perfect. Someone who comes and then like they're not so much interested in the text. It's like, well, that's okay, and like it's not to like judge that person, but it's like the whole bridging thing here is like, well, we have our busy work lives, and then we have our community things that we do, and then this is like an avenue or like for exercising that facet that is trying to do this thing. So if you're only involved in this side, that I can see the concern. I can definitely see the concern that if you come into the group and this is the only way that you're really involved, then it's like, well, where's that other stuff at? And it's like, well, yeah, we need to try to incorporate a little bit more of that into this, but also like where that is at this moment, it's like community potlucks and community work days, and we have documentary viewings and hikes, and there's all these other things, but those kind of just like don't fit into this medium.
So wait, hold on.
Oh yeah, go ahead.
There was a great example, is that when I tuned in to find the link, there was this little exchange about, I'll bring bread, I think I'll be ready at 6, or whatever that was. It was this so sweet process of like the mundane operations of being together in the same space, and I missed it, and I was like, oh, but I got a little taste of it. Like, they're gonna have dinner, that's so awesome. I can't be there, but like I know that somebody has the bread, and that there's a timing to this, and somebody's late from work. That's life, and that's what it means to be together. So that's what I'm talking about.
I wanted to say something though. Okay. Well, no, go ahead, and then I can wait.
No, just
okay.
Do it.
I just know how biological pressures can make you like any person.
Well, me, I get it.
Oh, okay. So but really quickly, maybe just a space to think through, and maybe not to discuss right now, but I think for me this sort of thing you just articulated, Dave, has been under my skin for a while, and I wasn't sure why it was making me uncomfortable, and I think I've found it, which is just like, is there a way, and know that we have to shift more into certain modes, right? And you can't always be in all the modes all at the same time, because that'll just devalue all the modes, right? But is there a way that it's not just academics getting their hands, like academics going into farmer world and farmers going into academic world? Is there a way we can meet somewhere in betweenness, where the roots of studying the life of the mind and the life of the body and the life of the soil aren't just like saying, okay, well, why do we hate each other? Let's like switch places and see what each other are like, where they're actually coming together to a fundamental foundation where it's like the cultivation of the soil is the cultivation of the mind, and the cultivation of community is the cultivation of the mind, and the cultivation of the mind is the cultivation of community, where it's not like we're just jumping territories, but it's like when I address you and you address me, and when we address a text, we're not just being academics, we are creating bonds, and we are enriching a community. And like maybe a text, for instance, when reading Wendell Berry opened my heart and mind to the possibility of working with the soil, to the possibility of caring for the earth. And it wasn't a separate thing. It was not a separate sphere. I was thinking about his poetry and his words while I actually decided to finally go out and like make a garden in my backyard, or my front yard, I mean. So I guess that's where my heart is I want to find a space of in-betweenness and integration that isn't just like compartmentalized. But I know we probably can't finish that conversation tonight.
Well, and just for the people who are new to this, because really like this is for Jacob and Isaiah and Joel, an opportunity. You're seeing something here that you might not have realized was going on with the group, like that we are like this nonprofit organization that's like doing more than just putting these courses on, right? And that's something that we talked about a little bit at the beginning of the Saussure talk, and I think we might have talked about it a little bit on the first day of being in time, but I'm not sure. But the point is like, yeah, we are one of our primary objectives is to be exploring ways of doing what Sammy and Lydia are talking about, and the first instantiation of it was a fundraiser to try to buy a farm that didn't work out. And now we're in the process, and it's very slow going, but like we're building to our first actually, concrete instantiation of like a sort of monastic almost model where, a community is like making something that they can sell to subsist so as to cooperatively like run a space for the pursuit of, yes, this cultivation of the mind as well. When you think of like the monks who make beer so that they can, spend 6 hours a day reading Aristotle, that's a lot closer to kind of like what this instantiation here on this property is looking like it's going to be. Brian's selling his house, probably. That's what it looks like currently. That's the idea being thrown around. We're building shepherd trailers, like tiny houses, and we're getting pigs and goats to do goat milk and to make goat cheese out of, and looking into other ways of making some like simple but like expensive or like very valuable in the products, so that we can be the artist who doesn't have to have a patron. Because like right now, we got our starter funds from the public through a crowdfunding campaign. We don't want to have to live reliant on that all the time. So like that's going into, okay, let's develop models then for how we could go about doing this thing where we want to be liberal arts, sciencey folk for the rest of our lives, but not relegated only to the university. So I just wanted to say all of that so that anyone who had not gotten that kind of an update could.
Thank you so much. So I didn't have any update. I didn't actually have any context for knowing like what's going on with you guys, because I only see you in this time dedicated for this purpose. So so that's something to think about. If I'm interested in the mission, should I show up to a different kind of conference call every once in a while where people just talk about what their day was like? That seems reasonable. Like, and so I think I want to know what's going on. That all sounds awesome. And I just wanted to, to address this letter issue that Sammy referenced, this 6-page letter. And actually just sort of clarify that when I hear both Sammy and Dave say extreme, we need to not waffle between extreme. Maybe we have been, and maybe we don't need to be waffling between extreme, not waffling, but torn between extremes. I just want to say that that letter was exactly about introducing a new level of seriousness to the conversation, not diminishing the scholarship, but increasing the seriousness of the scholarship by the practice of intentional communication and understanding of the purpose. So if the purpose is to integrate, for example, that's just different than comprehending. So, it was an unfortunate way that those communications came down. But in the end, I understood that letter to be a challenge toward seriousness, not away from it. And I also understand storytelling and contextual application of intellect to be serious work and rigorous labor, not some kind of frou-frou lack of academic rigor. I mean, and part of that comes from the fact that my education has been largely contextual in many ways. My education has been religious. So we are always doing praxis. We are always trying to figure out how theory itself is praxis and how practice is really where the learning happens, and articulating that to each other all across the spectrum. So I am absolutely certain that that model exists and works and doesn't take more, well, it does take more time. That would be a lie.
I would just add that, so that part of what you, so yeah, you said that you didn't know all of that. And we also hadn't, for instance, really told people like Jacob. And that was really just because the particular project to crunch through these texts was a sort of like, okay, we're on the other side of the campaign. We're taking a break for the summer. There's a little bit of stuff going on in the background, but it's not even stuff that we would be putting to newsletter just yet for our donors, you know, much less people who were kind of peripheral during the last 6 months, because it's been absolutely and utterly exhausting keeping up with everyone and having conversations that go on for hours and hours about process. And so that was, it was an ill-timed letter, and I didn't feel any commitment to the person, it being the second week. And our stated objective was very clear, that we're just trying to take a break from all this other stuff and just do this text thing. And it's like we're going monk, but we made it open to other people who want to be able to join in on that. But what you make me realize, so taking that's where my head was when I dealt with the letter and such. And maybe I didn't do it very well. Hi, Denise. But what you're making me realize is that, like, for someone such as yourself who came into the group because there was more about the group that you were interested in, that it was something that we should have articulated more extensively. That yeah, this is sort of a taking a break and just diving into a text. I, for one, am not willing to right now have a long conversation about what the blueprints will look like. That has been something that's been very slow, and like, you know, we have Ty and I had an 8-hour talk around the fire, and maybe we touched on it a couple of times. But the point, you know, and these things happen with everyone's kind of talking about these things and thinking through these things, but we're on sabbatical right now. And this is just a way of like, let's just do this, because we didn't get to do this in the last 7 months. You know, we've been all about hard work, academic, rigorous study and these other things, but then the rigorous study's not been a part of it whatsoever. And so I think that I'm going back to this again. This has been like an overcompensating or a going back in another direction, but Sammy pointed out, and I think it's eye-opening, yeah, that in doing so, for those who haven't been like part of the whole, in the mix of all of that chaos, it might look weird and just be like, what are y'all doing? If you're about this one thing, why aren't you So thanks for calling it to my attention, and it's something I still want to think about, just not like I've been enjoying thinking about things slowly, and not feeling the need to. And that, so like while you say that was that what it was asking for was more seriousness and more rigor about the community building aspect, I say yes. It was ill-timed because I was like trying to be on hiatus from everything but the reading, and I didn't say that, and maybe that's on me, but I mean, I didn't think I needed to, because we had said what we're doing here is just tackling this text, and let's keep it simple.
But he wasn't saying, let's go have coffee and talk about movies. He was saying, philosophy is personal. Philosophy is a way of life. And if we can't change a way of life, we're not doing philosophy. He was only saying what you guys have been saying. And you rejected that because it was somehow not rigorous study. And I just need to challenge that. It's very, very personally rigorous. And maybe what you're saying is that you're not up for personal rigor, emotional or relational at this moment, and that's fine too. I get that. You need a break from process stuff, but I don't think he was saying let's do endless process. I think he was just saying philosophy is a life.
I would agree, and I feel like a lot of it escalated because I was in the middle of needing to do emotional process stuff. And I felt like I felt a deep resonance with Lucas's letter. So I called attention to it at a time that was very inconvenient for example, Dave, to do that, where maybe it wasn't possible for him to address, or for everybody in the group to be on the same page addressing that. So I think that Lucas's letter is even something maybe we can come back to. Maybe what?
I'm not willing to. He's not part of the group right now. So it's not really, the thing is that it's 6 pages. If anybody wants to write me a 1-paragraph summary of it that we could then talk about or respond to, that's fine. But there were 1,000 points raised, and I'm not willing to address them all. I'm off for the summer.
That's what I said later.
I don't
board meeting later.
I don't want to have to think about doing it. And no one else responded to it either. It was just put on me to do it. And it was like, well, yeah, but that's not the point of what we're doing right now. So if somebody was involved with the other things that we're doing and then says any one of the points that it raises, sure, let's talk about it. Then when it comes up. But like, I just don't want to feel like that's a homework assignment for this group, because I feel like it is tangential. Oh, what's the word?
Tangential.
I feel like if anybody here has a thought about it, or a set of thoughts, but like that can literally be summarized and put into a little thing, then that's fine. I'm just like not really willing to like, and anybody else who wants to have that conversation without me as well, don't feel like that hangs on me and my participation. I'm just saying, I'm not up to it, and I don't foresee being up to it. It was anyone who wants to say the thing that really resonated with me from that letter was this one thing. Then sure, let's do that. But there was a lot more going on there. But I feel like maybe it's pointless because you have raised what you thought was important from that letter, and I feel like I have heard what you have raised from that letter. I just don't want to say that the letter itself is this object that needs to be approached later. Right, like what you have brought out of it so far, fair enough. Like this is the space that we open for that conversation.
Well,
Bye, Joel.
Bye, Joel. I think Ty and Denise probably need to go to bed, so it's probably a considerate time to end this. I just wanted to close with a little quote that has been shared with me before, but someone shared it with me this week, and it just like, I don't know, it's really stuck with me and resonated in relation to what we are doing here in this group and Turtle Island in general. And that is, and bear with me because it seems kind of cliche, and that is the laborer works with his body and his hands. The craftsman works with his body and his mind. The artist works with his body, his mind, and his heart. And I would like to see this group not only working with the mind and the hands. I would like to see this group working with the heart. And I know that the realm of the heart and of emotions, emotional and personal process, is one of the most difficult ones, because you can think through things, you can do schoolwork, and you can work with your hands, you can work with your body, while ignoring deep personal, like, let's say, traumas or things in the past, or like these issues. And I would say that the work of the heart is the hardest work that there is, and that it's also, a lot of it needs to be dealt with on one's own before coming to a group with others, and in maybe a smaller group, or especially. But I just wanted to leave that with everyone, that every time we come together to work together with our hands or to work together with our minds, we are always bringing our hearts with us, and our personal stories with us. And so being part of a group like this necessitates doing that work. And maybe you feel exhausted or incapable of doing that work at the moment, and just being honest about that and saying that to the group or to someone is sometimes enough, you know. But we just need to be all working with and on ourselves, in a sense, to become clear with where we are in that artistic and emotional sense.
I'm going to remain silent, as I largely have in this conversation. Well, it's the best I can do.
Well, I really have to pee, so as I'm sure all of you probably do, as anyone who drank this much mate probably does. Really, thank you everybody for hanging around this long. That was impressive. From now on, everyone has to hang around this long. How about that? I'm just kidding. Really appreciate y'all for joining. Hope y'all have a wonderful week. Feel free to follow up on this if you like. We're always looking for emails and additions to all of those documents building in the drive. If you don't have access to that, please let us know. And hope you have a wonderful rest of your week.
Yeah, thank you so much. I really enjoyed all of your presencing.
Thank you.
Bye.
See you soon.
Bye, everybody. See you next week.
Bye.
See ya.
Bye, Dave. Bye, Jacob.
See ya.
Oops.
How do I hang you up? Bye-bye.